Fate, Souls and Singularities by Mundatorem Chapter 63-65. Cave diving. Have you ever been to a place like this before, Ash-san? Mash asked as she followed after the saber. Ash bat aside a low-hanging branch as they trudged through the undergrowth of the island forest. The blonde-haired saber gave a small hum in response before he answered. I've been to areas that were heavily forested, he admitted, swatting away a bug near his ear, although they were less hospitable than this. Hospitable. Ritsuka slapped his neck, removing his hand and grimacing at the remains of the mosquito. That's a word for it. Still, is this really what you consider hospitable? Nothing's broken through the tree line to rip me in half yet. Ash replied without missing a beat, sliding down a small muddy incline onto a clearer section of the greenery, and I've yet to see a poison swamp or Gru shaman cast dark magics at me. What the hell is a Gru? Drake asked as she continued on ahead of them, looking over her shoulder with a raised eyebrow. I'm told they have a resemblance to goats. Ash replied in a disinterested tone of voice, although they still had the body of men. The smaller ones were almost twice my height. Ritsuka stared at his back, and the larger ones? He asked, already sensing the answer wasn't going to be a pleasant one. Ash frowned and looked around for a few moments before he pointed towards a tree, that size. Ritsuka, Mash and Drake followed his line of sight towards the 4-meter-tall tree. Or thereabouts. That's nice. Drake grumbled to herself, friendly sort, were they? No. Boudica frowned as she stepped over a small hole in the ground before continuing on her way. I don't suppose we have a specific direction we're searching for. Just following my gut. Drake hollered back from the front of the line with a voice full of bravado, never led me astray yet. It's not as though we have many leads to begin with. Archer commented as he scanned their surroundings. It isn't an especially big island, but all the same, I would recommend caution while exploring. Most magi tended to accompany bounded fields like this with traps. Trey, churras, rats, Havel grumbled as he walked through a log, the wood doing little to block the berserker's path and shattering underfoot. Archer and Boudica gave him a bland look at the display before continuing on as if nothing had happened. Should fight, face to face. Yes, I've never heard such a stronger incentive. Archer voiced out with a slightly mocking tone of voice. Havel paused and turned his head to stare at the archer. The tanned man gave no visible reaction at finding himself under the gaze of the larger servant. Considering your physical prowess, it wouldn't be wrong to say that any caster fool enough to fight you in hand-to-hand combat wouldn't be long for this world. Especially given your ability to render their magecraft useless. He walked past the berserker who was still standing frozen on the spot, head tracking the archer as he paid no heed to the servant. That's typically why they have to rely on tricks like this to level the playing field. Havel remained silent for a few moments before he released an irritated grumble, still, annoying. Boudica released an amused snort as she similarly walked past the berserker, giving him a faint smile. I know it's annoying, but try to bear with it for now. Fie. Nay, senpai. Mash whispered to Ritsuka as she looked over her shoulder. I've noticed that Havel-san seems to get along with Boudica-san and David-san. Me too. Ritsuka acknowledged, might be because neither of them are really mages. He reasoned, I don't know how he feels about Ash or Archer though. Considering Ash uses magic. I use pyromancy. Ash's voice had Ritsuka and Mash turn their attention towards him. It's a different school altogether with no ties to Seath. He paused and slowly took a step back towards the pair, although I am surprised he has not mentioned my use of black flames. He shrugged, perhaps he does not care. I'm a little jealous of that. Ritsuka admitted, still think he doesn't like me that much. He probably doesn't. Ash replied immediately, causing Mash to shoot him a rather disappointed look at the way Ritsuka flinched, although you will have time to earn some modicum of trust from him, I should think. Ritsuka gave an appreciative hum in response before he looked towards Drake. By the way, Captain. Yeah. Drake raised up a bush, looking either side before casting a glance over her shoulder. How did you meet Oscar and David anyway? Drake blinked and scratched the back of her head. Well, the green-haired guy just walked into the bar one day and asked if he could join the crew. She shrugged, he's not terrible in a fight, but it was mainly because he could play. Play. Ritsuka titled his head. He has an instrument. Drake nodded her head. Plays a harp. Always a good thing to have some music on a voyage. No. I've never really been on a ship before today. Ritska replied with a slightly sheepish expression, so I probably wouldn't know. Huh, Drake blinked, turning her head, what about you Mash? You ever been on the sea? Huh, Mash jolted at being addressed before she shook her head in response, no, this is the first time I've really been out into the world. Drake stared at her with a blank look for a few moments before turning away. That's so, she sniffed, anyway, as for the night. Well, was sailing one say and caught sight of a signal fire on an island. Figured it would at least be worth checking out. She blew air from out between her teeth. Next thing I know these two guys in armor come sprinting out as if they've got the devil himself riding their ass. Oscar makes a break for me and just says to sail, even pushes the ship away from the shore and all. The other must have been Oscar Sand's friend. Mash reasoned, did you see what was chasing them? Drake shook her head, nope. Never saw that, all I know is that we sail away as fast as we can and then the island explodes. She shrugged, he just said that whatever it was is probably dead now. I'd imagine it's more than probably. Ritska wryly retorted, considering the island blew up, still, pursed his lips and looked at Mash, probably a noble phantasm, yeah. Most likely, senpai. Mash replied with a nod, although the damage would make it a very high-ranked one. Most likely into the anti-fortress category or perhaps higher. Feel like we should come up with a new category. Ritska replied, anti-island. Well it was just gone next moment. Drake waved her hand, although he didn't seem too broken up about his mate, I assume that's just a ghost thing with you lot, no. She directed the question towards Ash. We're just more used to death. Ash replied with a toneless voice, you get used to it after some time. Huh, fair enough. Drake dismissed easily as she squinted her eyes ahead of them, so, none of you ever been on the ocean before then, eh? The woman looked over her shoulder at the group, how you finding it? Certainly unforgettable. Ritska replied with a strained smile, his mind flying back to his cleaning duties in the ship, although I suppose it's an experience. And you Mash? Drake looked to the girl, how you finding life at sea? Well, Mash blinked, struggling to find the right words, well. It's big but I've been so busy on the ship I haven't really had time to notice more of it, she admitted after a few moments with a sheepish expression. Drake gave her a discerning gaze before her face softened, don't worry about it kid. Before we're done here I'll make sure you can see the sea for what it is. A smile came to her face, it'll be a sea unrivaled in beauty. Her eyes fell onto Ash, the unkindled advancing without a sign of emotion on his face, at least so you can appreciate life more than this one. Ash paused and sent the woman a mild glare in response before huffing and looking away. Ritska and Mash watched the reaction with slight concern on their features before Drake turned on her heel and bat aside a branch in front of her. Come on then, clues ain't gonna find themselves. She called out as she charged into the undergrowth, Ash still staring off to the side as Ritska and Mash jogged up to him. Are you alright, Ash-san? Mash asked with an apprehensive frown on her face. You and Captain Drake have been, at odds. At each other's throats. Ritska supplied, crossing his arms and looking the unkindled up and down before his own features turned worried. Are you okay? Ash sniffed once before turning back to the pair and putting on a smile, nothing worth worrying about. She has her inclinations and I have mine. Ritska had noticed that Ash's smiles were increasingly forced as of late. He'd noticed that most of the time his smiles were just put on as if he was trying to appear jolly. The only time he'd seen a genuine smile on the Saber's face was when they met up with Cecilia in Rome, although given that Ash and the Fire Keeper had a personal history it was probably understandable. Whatever else, she is correct in this regard. Ash turned away from the duo and walked on after Drake. We do have a search ahead of us if we are to find a way off this island. Ash hadn't even answered the question, Ritska noted with a frown. Clearly Mash had noticed it as well, given that she was also sporting a similar look of her own. The two exchanged glances before they followed after the Saber and Drake. Wonder what has them so concerned. Boudica frowned as she watched the trio ahead of them, not having been party to the conversation. Ash probably has some issues with Drake still. Archer voiced out as he walked alongside the rider, as long as he doesn't do something stupid then I doubt there will be much of an issue. Boudica made a noise which indicated she wasn't quite convinced of that fact. Well, I suppose if someone didn't have a lot of experience with others then they might be a bit difficult to get along with. She's probably lucky he doesn't know about her history in its entirety. Archer grunted in response, although that depends on what his opinion on the slave trade is. Boudica winced in response, she could see how that would be an issue. Something snapped behind them, causing them both to whirl around to see Havel having walked through a log and paused, staring at the pair of them. Helmet moving in between the two of them repeatedly. SLA. They, TRA, duh. The berserker tilted their head. You, had, SLA, vase. Archer pursed his lips and turned away. Boudica shot him an annoyed glare at his retreating form as he left her to explain the nuances to the berserker with no telling how he would react to it. Not me specifically, but there was a history of slavery. Havel shrugged. Didn't think you had it in you, was all he offered as he walked past her, seemingly uncaring about it. Giants, more useful, though. Boudica stared at his back incomprehensibly for a few moments before she released a sigh. Berserkers were always a handful, although she wasn't exactly sure how she was supposed to respond to that piece of advice. She paused, furrowing her brows as she tried to recall a conversation she'd once had with Sigward. Wasn't he best friends with a giant? She thought to herself, shooting another glance at Havel's retreating form. Her expression tightened, thinking it best to not mention that in the presence of the man, or he was already aware of how giants were treated. Either way, it probably would be best if she didn't try to bring it up, considering it would most likely dampen his mood. What sort of thing are we looking for anyway? Ritska asked with a curious expression. Drake paused ahead of them and looked down at the trio behind her. The group having started to climb up a small embankment of rocks. Don't know yet, Drake replied with a shrug, still following my instinct. A carefree grin came to her face, but I'll know it when I see it. That sounds terribly vague, came Ritska's part worried part bemused reply, his lips curling into a half-smile. He'd started to get an idea about the type of person Drake was at this point. That's the whole thing with Instinct Kid. Drake waved her hand in response, turning around and resuming her climb. You'll never know what's going to happen until it hits you square in the face. Isn't it normally too late to do anything about it by that point? Mash looked towards Ash for some small part of assurance. She found herself marginally disappointed when the saber merely nodded his head in response to Drake's comment. That is typically how it works with exploration. Ash voiced with a knowing tone. More often than not, my own ventures were a case of picking a direction and walking. He paused, looking towards Mash. You get used to it after some time. Especially if you are in an area you have never been before, the only thing you can really do is just follow a path. He gets it. Drake pointed towards Ash before tilting her head and frowning. How is it you understand the basics of going out on an adventure without actually getting the adventure part right? Because it's a useful skill to have. Ash sharply replied, and not one I obtained just so I could gallivant around the ruins of Lothric. He pursed his lips, looking away from them. That was something that appealed to others more than I, and it worked out just as well for them as I expected. Bet they had more fun than you though. Ash aimed a burning glare at Drake. The woman took the anger in stride before turning away and continuing up the rocks before coming to a stop at the summit of the incline. Well, that's what we're after, she exclaimed with a triumphant tone, turning around and waving the Chaldeans towards her. Told you it was all about instinct. I don't know what I hate about her more. Ash darkly muttered under his breath, her personality or the fact she's consistently right. Ritska and Mash sent worried glances at him as they climbed up towards Drake. Archer, Boudica and Havel cleared the treeline behind them and quickly took after the quartet in climbing to the top of the rock formation. Drake was awaiting them with a patient smile at the summit, hand resting on her hip before giving Ash a challenging smirk, ready for an actual adventure. Ash didn't deign her with a reply, instead moving past her and staring down, promptly blinking once before he frowned. That's unexpected. Drake clicked her tongue at the rather lackluster reaction before looking to the others. This something we're after. The others peered past her and into the rather large entrance to a chasm carved into the side of a rock face leading downwards. Faces promptly morphed into ones of bewilderment or incomprehension, with the exception of Havel, who remained silent at the sight that greeted them. The interior of the chasm had been carved. Rather than a formation of loosely collected rocks or stalagmites, what instead greeted the Chaldeans was an intricately carved structure, staircases made from chiseled marble stone which seemed to shoot off in every angle alongside arches which were bent at completely the wrong angle, or paths which seemed to lead towards the sides of the walls and them climb upwards into new structures. What the? Ritska breathed out in shock. That's, his eyes darted in every direction before he wet his lips. Why yeah. He let out a shaky breath before looking towards Mash. That's the type of thing we're after, right Mash? Yes senpai. Mash gave a firm nod, although she was still transfixed on the sight before them. This has to be the work of whomever set up the bounded field around the island. No sense in waiting then. Drake cheerfully exclaimed as she jumped down onto the smooth path below which led to the nearest staircase. Let's get going then. Wait. Mash tried to stop her. Shouldn't we also get Oscar-san and David Saw? If we go and get those two then come back, what if this place is gone? Drake turned back to Mash with a raised eyebrow. And what if someone comes for my ship while we're all in there? Waving a hand towards the absurd layout of the chasm. You gotta seize the chances that present themselves Mash. The woman span on her heel and marched on without a care in the world. This is what it means to be a part of my crew. She's not wrong. Ash grumbled as he dropped down. Once again, his boots slammed into the ground with a heavy thud before he followed after the captain. Ritska and Mash looked at each other before the former offered a shrug. Guess we're doing this, huh? He pat Mash on the back. I'm sure it'll be fine, probably. That doesn't sound very encouraging senpai. Mash worriedly replied before a heavy thud had them turn their heads towards Havel. The stone-armored berserker stared down at the buildings and support pillars jutting from the wall at odd angles before he turned his head towards Ritska. You, going, as, well? The berserker asked, the veiled challenge in his tone. Ritska met the berserker's gaze with his own determined expression, giving a single nod in response. Wouldn't be much of a master if I abandoned my servants, right? He asked before looking down. Besides, if our answers are down there, I want to be present as well. Havel stared at him before turning away and quietly muttering under his breath, not bad answer. The servant stepped off the drop and plummeted towards the ground. Ritska instinctively covered his ears as Havel crashed into the marble flooring. The rock shattered under his impact and released a dreadful sound which seemed to echo through the entire chasm. Ritska slowly took his hands off his ears and turned to face his other servants. Guess we don't have the element of surprise anymore, huh? He rhetorically asked with a shrug. Archer crossed his arms, staring at the formation. No, but with something of this scale the caster of it would instantly be aware of intruders anyway. He looked back at Ritska and gave him a thin smirk. So we never truly had it to begin with. I don't know if that makes me feel better or worse now. You can decide later. Boudica offered with an encouraging smile. Do you want to climb down or do you want myself or Mash to carry you? Ritska stared at her unblinkingly for a few moments, then looked down at the nearest climb before back at the rider. I think I'll give climbing a go. Suit yourself. Boudica replied, not appearing offended in the least at the rejection. Did we pass that pillar already? Ritska suddenly asked, pointing towards one of the marble pillars off to the side of them. Ash turned and looked over his shoulder while Drake paused. The pair of them stared at the pillar before looking back at Ritska. No. They both replied at the same time. Ritska absently nodded his head. Just checking, feels as though we're going to get lost in here though. I have experience navigating mazes. Ash reassured him as he turned on his heel and continued walking along the path. Ritska followed after him and tried not to think about how they were technically walking sideways along the wall. This is somewhat reminiscent of Dungeons of Irithyll. How'd you end up in dungeons? Drake asked, sounding slightly interested in whatever answer Ash was going to give her. I was looking for entry into the profaned capital. Ash replied back, it was said to lie beneath the city which I had heard dungeons typically lay at the base of. So you went exploring through dungeons on the off chance it did lead towards a secret passage to a lost city. Drake surmised, looking over her shoulder and giving the unkindled a smirk, you missed your calling as a treasure hunter. I very much doubt that. Ash dismissed almost immediately with a curt tone, their eyes turned upwards towards the other parts of the structure. The saber paused walking, staring up as the twists and turned extended further than the eye could see and continually intersected in differing pillars, stairs and arches. This has all the hallmarks of an illusion. Illusion. Ritska titled his head, You mean like what Gwyndolin does? Of a sort. Ash nodded. The bottomless boxes were crafted through use of illusions. The exterior of the box is smaller than the interior. He pointed upwards and drew Ritzka's attention to the seemingly endless expanse of decorum across the cave interior. I assume this cave would never be able to hold this within it otherwise. Ritzka stared for a few moments before he slowly nodded his head in affirmation, probably. Although a lot of this Magecraft stuff is going over my head at the moment. I assume Olga is getting irritated at that. Oh yes. Ritzka chuckled as he walked past Ash, following after Drake. I am trying, but I think she's just stressed right now. She has reason to be. Ash replied as he walked alongside the boy. Our current situation is somewhat stressful, and towards those with no experience I do not blame them for being almost overwhelmed. Although she should be commended that she has yet to give in. Ritzka hummed in response. I don't think giving in is much of an option, he admitted quietly. Kind of don't have a choice. I suppose we do not, do we? Ash remarked, although you have to decide upon yourself if there is truly such a thing as no choice. Ritzka was silent for a few moments before he looked to the saber. Do you think there's such a thing? I think there is such a thing as always having a choice. Ash replied, whether or not the choice has any meaning is something very different. More often than not I was faced with no choice because the alternative held no purpose to it. An option for the sake of saying there was more than one available. He pursed his lips. Perhaps there is such a thing as no choice in those situations. If only because you cannot bear the idea of allowing it. Suppose this would be one of those times, huh? That depends. Ash shrugged. You can either attempt to save humanity or you can lie back and just let them all die. He looked towards Ritzka with a blank expression. There is a choice available to you in that situation, but the alternative would not be considered. Yeah. Ritzka nodded his head slowly. That's true enough. He muttered, frowning as he continued to walk through the labyrinth. Where do you think we are, anyway? Don't know. Ash shook his head. Rarely seen decorum like this. He ran his hands along the deep brown stone wall. There were parts of Anor Londo which were similar enough, especially the ascending stairs, but this layout is maddening. Yeah, how do you think we've been walking on the ceiling this whole time? Ritzka asked. Ash stared at him and then looked down at his feet before turning his eyes up. They remained staring upwards, or perhaps downwards, for a few moments before returning their attention to Ritzka. Magic. Ash offered his way of an answer. Ritzka stared at him for a few moments before he cracked a faint smile of his own. Probably right. Mash was a short distance behind the duo of Ritzka and Ash. She had wanted to keep pace with the pair of them, mainly because it was her duty as a servant to never stray far from her master, but an unexpected variable had kept her away for the moment. The variable in question being the rather large stone-armored berserker currently giving her a side glance as they walked side by side. Is something wrong, Havel-san? She eventually asked. The berserker remained silent for a few moments before he pointed at her sword on her hip. Didn't use when we first met. His head tilted slightly. Why? Ah. She understood the question. I didn't have a sword at the time. I've only recently acquired one. It's mainly because Vrindari-sensei said that I shouldn't fight with just a shield. She paused before pursing her lips. Although I admit that it is easier to use the shield rather than the sword, it feels right. Havel grunted and looked ahead of them. Tried, club. He shifted Dragon Tooth on his shoulder for emphasis. Don't need lot of skill. Mash stared at him before shaking her head in response. No, I've only been practicing with a sword. Although Ash-san suggested I use a spear instead because I'm using a great shield. She paused for a few moments. I haven't actually gotten around to practicing with a spear though. Faye. Havel made a dismissive scoff. Club. Better. He removed his own from his shoulder and held it out in front of him. Made. From. Dragon. Tooth. Never. Break. He turned down to look at Mash, then seemingly stared at her arms before making a thoughtful noise. Arms. Look. Ski. NNY. Thou. GH. Mash felt as though she should have taken offense to that. While she was certain that the berserker was physically superior to her, that didn't mean she couldn't pull her weight. She would have liked to think so anyway. Her eyes turned away from the berserker. Thus far she felt as though others had been doing most of the work for her. I could try it though, right? She felt like asking, staring up at the berserker. Havel let out a small noise in response. Small club, he pointed out, resting his own large weapon back on his shoulder. Light on feet. The helmet directed its attention to the shield. Looks weighty. It isn't that heavy. Mash replied quickly. Good, club. Club. She stared at the shield. Something inside of her felt mildly affronted that the shield was referred to as a mere club, but it wasn't exactly wrong. She had found that swinging it at enemies was something that came easier to her than sword play. It did feel more natural, although she had put that down to her heroic spirit not manifesting with anything other than a shield. It has a lot of weight behind the strikes. Mash replied after a few moments, but it is easier to wield with 2 hands than 1. Big shield. Havel dryly replied, or as best he could with his graveled voice, as he nodded towards it. Prack. 'Tis much. Mash shook her head. These ray shifts are the only times I can effectively utilize my power as a servant. Although I have been getting some experiences of late, especially during the dumpling heist. Havel released a sigh. Not much, then, he pondered to himself. Hand. Mash opened her mouth to speak and then slowly closed it, looking away in thought. She hadn't received that much in the way of hand-to-hand combat. It wasn't something bad to learn. If she lost her sword, she wouldn't be able to retrieve it in the same way she could with her shield, and if an enemy servant did get close enough, it would be best if she could defend herself. I haven't, no, was the eventual reply she gave. Havel released a thoughtful hum. The smith, Andre San. Havel nodded his head. Ask him. Mash blinked at the berserker. Why? Looks like he can throw punch, Havel grounded out. He could tell with one look at the man. Then again, only a fool went to Lordran in the later years without knowing how to fight for themselves in some capacity. That and having some level of physical prowess was common for Astorans. Worth a try. Do you know how to fight without your club? Mash slowly asked, a curious expression on her face. Havel was silent for a few moments before he gave a slow nod to her. Depends, if I'm still around. Mash understood his meaning, frowning heavily. Havel-san. Does senpai act like mages you know of? Havel was silent for a few moments before replying. Not bad, so far. He eventually replied in a quiet tone before he continued on. Mash's slightly hopeful face faltered at his next sentence. Nothing special, so far. Still, chance to disappoint. Senpai isn't like that. Mash replied almost instantly. HMPH. Havel let out a dismissive grunt. Will decide for self. Drake paused as she came to a cross-section. The wait allowed the others to catch up swiftly, the woman looking left and right for a few moments before shrugging and walking left. Ritsuka and Ash exchanged glances before following after her. Feels like we've been walking for a little while now. Ritsuka commented with a frown. How far does this place go? Who knows? He looked over his shoulder to see Archer just behind him. The servant held a heavy frown as his eyes continually scanned their surroundings. However, what concerns me is the lack of response. Steel gray eyes turned their attention to Ritsuka. I had thought we would have encountered something by now. Either a trap or an inhabitant. But there's nothing. Ash continued on, nodding his head in affirmation. Yes, an area of this scale should house something of note, but there is little here. Not even signs that anything lived here to begin with. Is that good or bad for us? Ritsuka asked. Archer pursed his lips and released a sigh. It could go either way. He replied after a few moments. We've either entered an empty territory of another servant while they're away, or the owner of this is playing it cautious and lulling us into a false sense of security. Great. Ritsuka whispered under his breath. Either no one is home or they're secretly waiting for us to slip up. Precisely. Archer bluntly stated, looking towards Mash. I'd recommend you keep by your master's side. He'll be a prime target if something is waiting for us in here. Mash nodded her head, quickly jogging over towards Ritsuka and almost sticking to him like glue. The boy didn't look as though he minded, however. Although that was likely because Archer had told him he would be the first target of a possible servant attack that had him slightly more jumpy. Don't get that look on your face. Boudica chided Ritsuka with a playful slap on the back, giving him a warm smile. We're all here to protect you as well. Letting anything get its hands on you would make us pretty terrible servants. She's correct. Ash called out from ahead of them, turning around to face Ritska fully with a determined look on his face. As a warrior of sunlight, keeping my summoner alive is essential to my oath. He paused for a few moments before giving a half shrug. You also aren't terrible company to keep. Does that include me? Drake amusedly called from ahead of them. Ash's features flattened as he turned to her. You're still alive, Aaron. Whatever else he was going to say was cut off when the wall directly to his left exploded outwards. Debris from the crash was sent flying through the entire hallway. Mash instantly dived in front of Ritska, raising her shield while the other servants all readied their weapons. Drake let out a curse and stumbled backwards, raising her pistols and aiming them towards the cloud of smoke having been kicked up by the sudden arrival of something. Ash span around to face the new hole, instantly going for the sword on his back before a roar emerged from the cloud. The sound instantly cleared the obscure figure and revealed a giant, standing around 3 meters tall with lightly tanned skin, fluffy long hair and only a metal waistband for armor with red fabric as a skirt descending from it. It became fully visible to all. The head was covered by a black iron helmet shaped like a bull, twin jutting horns shot upwards as the giant's attention fixed itself solely upon Ash. The saber barely managed to pull his sword from off his back before the giant servant released another roar and charged him. The servant, because it couldn't have been anything else, slammed into Ash with all the force of a rampaging bull, instantly blasting him off his feet and crashing into the wall behind him. The servant didn't stop with flinging him before it continued its charge, crashing into him in a burst of speed that rendered it little more than a blur to the naked eye and carrying the pair of them through wall and out of eyesight. The continuous sounds of crashing rock and heavy footfalls beginning to teeter off indicated that the servant was carrying Ash through nearly everything it could. Ash-san. Mash's voice entered Ritska's ears soon after, sounding downright horrified at the surprise attack. After him, Ritska called out before he could help himself, scrambling past the shielder and towards the direction of the new hole. Sliding to halt in front of it, he saw the servant had carried Ash through virtually everything behind the wall until neither were visible, although he could still vaguely hear the sounds of heavy impacts in the distance. Surprisingly enough, Drake was the first one sprinting through the hole, barging past Ritska. Ain't no one stealing my crew, she exclaimed in an aggressive tone, even if he's an ass. In any other instance, Ritska would have found it amusing. Right now he couldn't appreciate it all that much considering that Ash had basically been kidnapped and was now alone with whatever servant was. That would have been the owner of this place. Archer clicked his tongue, sprinting after Drake. Hurry. Yes. Mash fiercely nodded her head. Come on, senpai. Havel watched as the pair of them followed after the archer, noticing Boudica barely give him a glance before she followed after them. The berserker remained stationary for a few moments before he broke off into a sprint as well. He lacked subtly and virtually matched the enemy servant in volume as his footfalls echoed out around them. Ash wasn't sure how many walls he had crashed through at this point. He'd lost count and was acutely aware they had changed direction at some point, the servant in front of him still with its shoulder slamming into his chest and driving him backwards at full speed. Managing to get his left hand free, he slammed it onto the front of the bull-shaped helmet. The pyromancer glove began heating up before letting loose an explosion directly onto the face of his attacker. The bull-headed servant released a roar of pain or anger, possibly both, as it slowed down abruptly. Ash continued on, being flung away and crashing head-first into a nearby pillar. His head was still shaking, he couldn't remember the last time he'd been hit by something that hard. If he was to hazard a guess, the time Yorm kicked him probably came close. Shaking his head, he fixed his attention on the servant in front of him, quickly rising to his feet and drawing Storm Ruler from his back and holding it with both hands. The bullhead was still glowing red with head, accompanied by a slight sizzle, but the servant didn't seem to care. Tightening its grip on the dual halberds it held in each hand, both being longer than Ash was tall. He'd experienced this type of thing multiple times however, and with the earlier attack he at least confirmed that he could use his pyromancies against this thing. The two of them stared at each other for what felt like hours. Ash steeled his expression while the servant began to pace around him, the eye ports on the helm giving off a subtle red glow to them. After a few moments, the enemy servant stopped moving, tensing its body and placing one leg behind the other and bending at the knee. Ash recognized the charge and readied himself to dodge. The servant exploded into action, kicking off the ground with enough force to shatter the stone underfoot and sending a blast wave shooting backwards in a buckshot, the shards obliterating the nearby walls and pillars. The halberd in its right hand was thrust towards his chest. Ash ducked low, rolling under the thrust and feeling the axe head barely clip against the chain mail under his cloth before righting himself and swinging up towards the servant's left leg. The second halberd stabbed itself into the ground upright. Storm Ruler slammed into the pole and stopped short. Ash instantly fired off a blast of wind and shot himself away sideways as the thrust from the first halberd changed into a slash. The weapon missed him entirely as he escaped to just outside of its range. The servant reeled in the halberd, gripping it tightly just underneath the axe head and pulling the other one from the ground before charging him again. Ash reacted first, freeing his left hand and tossing a fireball quickly towards the servant's face as he rolled to the side. The servant ceased their charge and raised the flat end of their weapons to block the spell, blocking Ash from their sight. Taking advantage of the distraction, Ash charged towards the servant's right side, thrusting the greatsword towards the knee. The servant barely caught sight of them as a blur in the corner of their eye, the helmet snapping down to him in an instant as they swung the pole of their right halberd backwards to divert the strike. The black metal clipped the gray blade and forced it instead to just graze the servant's thigh. Ash clicked his tongue as he felt it barely make an impact. A small bruise appearing where the servant had been struck but no blood. Pulling the sword back, he held it up in a block as the second halberd was swung towards him. Ash's knees buckled as the giant slammed the weapon into his guard as hard as it could, the ground cracking beneath his feet from the impact. The servant pushed down at an odd angle, breaking Ash's guard and sending him stumbling backwards. The servant pulled back its left halberd and thrust the spear tip at the top of the weapon towards his head. Ash bodily threw himself to the side as the weapon just avoided his head as he went into a backwards roll to get some distance. Letting out a growl, the servant raised bow halberds above their head and swung them downwards towards him. Ash jumped back as they slammed into the ground where he had been stood, the weapons instantly cratering the stone floor and sending spider web cracks through the entire room. "RRRRAAAGGHH." The servant cried out, charging towards him as they removed their weapons from the ground. "Ha!" Mash slammed her shield into their side as she came charging out of the opening the pair had come through. The servant stumbled from the impact and spanned their halberd around to strike at her only for a beam of light to slam into their shoulder. Drake let out a triumphant howl as the servant stumbled back, the cannon disappearing over her shoulder, and the strike aimed at Mash went high, completely flying over her head. The red blur of Archer came in next, wielding a pair of black and white short swords as he immediately rushed towards the servant's legs. Shooting past them, he slid to a halt and span on his heel, reversing his grip on the blades and slashing at the back of the servant's legs. The twin blades seemingly cut deeper than Ash's sword, drawing trace amounts of blood from the fresh cuts and having the servant buckle under the strike. Several flashes of gold light slammed into their face, causing them to reel back as Boudica flew into the room next, her sword still glowing from having released the magical attacks on the servant. Ash thrust Storm Ruler towards the servant's right leg which Archer hadn't cut. The sudden gale force of wind smashed into the ground and caused them to lose their footing. The larger servant stumbled as they swung out with their right halberd. The weapon skated off the surface of Mash's shield, causing the girl to grit her teeth but not fall over. A heavy charging footfall indicated the sudden arrival of Havel, who ignored any sense of strategic targeting and just slammed into the servant at full force, the bull-headed figure receiving a similar experience to Ash as Havel lifted them off their feet with a waist tackle and smashed them into the nearest wall. They instantly shot their body up straight, striking the enemy servant in the chin with the top of their helmet as they did so, and took a single step backwards. Dragon Tooth manifested in their hands before both of them clasped onto the handle. Havel reared the club back and then swung it towards the servant's exposed chest at full force. The enemy had enough sense to raise their arms in a blocking motion to try and mitigate some of the damage. Not that it evidently did them much good as the moment Havel's club made contact with them, the sounds of snapping bones echoed around the room and were soon followed by screams of pain from the larger servant. Their right arm having been at the forefront having taken the worst of the blow and now sporting an unfortunate bend in the wrist. They lashed out with a kick, their shin struck Havel in the side and caused him to stumble before he raised his left hand and punched downwards into the ankle. The servant let out another cry of anguish as a popping sound soon filled the room. Havel raised his club above his head, preparing to deliver a final strike. The servant seemingly exploded into action as if propelled by some newfound fervor. Their left hand shot out and clasped itself around Dragon Tooth before his right leg kicked outwards, striking Havel in the chest with his heel and sending him skating backwards while also ripping the club from his hand. The servant pulled their arm back and threw the club as hard as they could. The tooth shot across the room in an instant. Mash jumped in the way of the throw, attempting to block it as the weapon made contact. Goo! She released a gasp as the impact blasted her off her feet and carried her backwards in the direction she had come from. Ritska chose that unfortunate moment to stumble into the room, still breathing heavily just as the blur of Mash approached him. Archer roughly gripped his shoulder and tossed him out of the way as Mash shot past him before crashing into the ground and sending the club flying on in a spinning motion. Careful idiot. Archer chided him heavily, spinning the twin swords in his hands. This one still has some fight in them. Ritska could barely release a noise as Boudica helped him to his feet and jumped in front of him, preparing her small shield and sword. The enemy servant stabbed their left halberd into the ground, using it as a support as they slowly rose to their one working foot. Hobbling slightly as they stared at the group in front of them, a fearsome growl resonated from their throat. "Won't let you near her," they warned, tightening their grip on their weapon and attempting to get themselves into some type of stance. Havel stared at the direction where his club had been hurled before slowly craning his neck to face the servant again, raising his hands and cracking his knuckles. He took a single step forwards before he paused, sucking in heavily and spinning around to where the new hole was. "Show self, Lord," he growled. A silence filled the room before the gentle sound of heels against the stone floor filled the emptiness. From beyond the darkness a small figure emerged, shorter than Mash by around 20 centimeters. The purple-haired girl with a youthful, and somewhat attractive, visage stepped into the light. Wearing a silken dress with black highlights and an apprehensive look on her face. "I'll go with you all right," she snapped at them, earning looks from all of the servants in the room. "I'll do whatever you say." She rushed past them. Havel's head followed her movements until she was stood in front of the other servant with her arms outstretched and almost a glare on her face. "Just don't hurt him anymore." A completely different silence filled the room as the servants all looked around at each other, exchanging dubious glances before turning their attention back onto the girl. "Well," she looked around them, "what are you waiting for? It's me you're after, right? Your freakish captain wants me, doesn't he?" Drake scratched the back of her head, looking around for a few moments before staring at the girl with a confused expression. "Pretty sure I don't." Huh. The wind was seemingly taken from the girl's sails as she stared at Drake with a dumbfounded expression. "What? But why aren't you here for me?" Ritska peeked from behind Boudica with a puzzled look. "No." He sheepishly answered, "Unless, do you have the Holy Grail?" "The Grail?" The girl looked at him weirdly. "No. Why would I have that?" An insulted expression came to her. "Aren't I enough for you? You think you need more than me? Why so small?" Havel's voice eventually came out from his helmet, staring down at the girl. His whole form reeking of genuine bewilderment. "Thought you were God. Des. Wah." The girl sputtered and then fixed Havel with a glare. "I am a goddess, you giant oaf. Stone armor." She looked him up and down before gaining a self-satisfied smirk. "Fitting considering your head must be as thick as a rock if you can't recognize my beauty as nothing short of divine. Guinevere, prettier." The girl froze on the spot as an icy glare entered her eyes, her lips thinning out. "Then perhaps you just have no taste." Mash stumbled into the room, still looking dazed from the blow. "I'm back, senpai," she exclaimed full on confidence, then froze as she took stock of the strange gathering present. Where did? "So, you're a goddess then?" Ash asked for clarification as he squinted at her. It was true that he could most certainly feel potent divinity from her, however a frown soon came to him. "Why do you feel so weak? You think all divines are mindless brutes?" Clicking her tongue, she softened her features and flicked her hair back. "Some of us chose to pursue true beauty." She was met with blank looks in response, her expression soon faltering into an indignant glare. "What? Where is all the lavish praise you're supposed to give me? A genuine goddess of beauty stands before you. Isn't this why you came here?" Ritska scratched behind his head. "We weren't really looking for you." "Really? Yeah, he awkwardly finished, looking away from her. We got stuck. Drake carried on, giving the girl an odd look, and, are you serious? The girl cut her off with a glare. You're also misleading. You come barging in here and hurt Asterios. She gestured to the servant, now named Asterios, behind her. The large figure let out a small groan in response. I mean, technically you attacked us first. Ritska pointed out, eyes flicking between Asterios and the girl. He did kind of throw Ash through several walls. More than that, Ash shouldered his greatsword, looking at the girl with a frown, and there is the matter of this fog wall you have put up, trapping us on the island. The oh, you mean the bounded field. She sighed, raising her right hand to cradle her head. It wasn't meant to trap you. It was meant to stop him from getting to us. Him? Mash asked, trying to understand. Are you being pursued by someone? Yes. The goddess answered with a slightly disturbed tone. He's a nuisance and a disgusting pervert to boot. Sounds terrible. Drake raised an eyebrow, tapping her boot on the ground. So can you free my ship or not? I suppose if you aren't here for us there's no sense in leaving you trapped here. She turned and away from them, quickly making her way over to Asterios and fussing over him. You sit down, you're hurt enough as it is and I won't have you making your injuries worse. The servant let out a small noise of affirmation before slowly lowering themselves back into a seating position. Ash gradually made his way back over to Ritska and the others, still making sure to keep the goddess and the brute in his line of sight. What do you suggest we do, Ritska? He quietly asked when he was close enough to them. I'm not sure. Ritska replied. She said she'd take down the bounded field so we can leave now, right? We should be able to, Senpai. Mash replied with a nod, looking back over to the two servants with a mild frown, although I am surprised that convincing her went as easily as it did. I'm not. Ash crossed his arms. Her bodyguard is wounded and as far as divine presences go, he trailed off with a frown, looking over to Havel. The berserker turned to face him and gave a nod in response. Path. Edik, Havel threw a thumb over his shoulder at the small girl, like, child. Child. The girl span around with a scowl on her face. I heard that, brute. And, honestly, how rude. She grumbled to herself, for your information, I am the goddess Euryale. Who? The girl released an annoyed sound and went back to tending to the larger servant. The goddess Euryale is one of the three Gorgon sisters. Mash explained to Havel, you met Medusa in Fuyuki, didn't you? Havel tilted his head, weird, Harb. Mash nodded her head, oh, remember, her. And the director said she met Steno when we found Gwyndolin Sand. Mash looked back to Ritska. Euryale is the second oldest among them with Steno being the oldest and Medusa being the youngest. Ooh. Ritska nodded his head, then paused and looked back at the small girl. His brows furrowed in confusion and then looked back at Mash, second oldest. Divine spirits are different. Archer answered, their appearances aren't always as truthful as you would believe. All right. The boy made a small noise of understanding, so what do we do now? Leave, I assume. Archer replied, then frowned, although it might be easier to just kill them. Nah. Drake shook her head, a thoughtful look on her face. Hey, girly. What? Euryale turned around to face her with a frown. As soon as Asterios is well the bounded field will be taken down. What else do you want? You got someone chasing after you, right? It has nothing to do with you. The goddess frowned when Drake shook her head and cracked a grin. See, it does. I love interesting things. Drake grinned, dungeons, monsters, treasure hunting, all of it. This world has so much of that stuff to enjoy. The woman shrugged, but that's that. See, her eyes fixed themselves upon Euryale. You two need to avoid whoever's chasing you and we're looking for help finding this Grail thing. Ritska had a notion he could see where this conversation was going. So the answer is simple. Drake exclaimed, pointing towards the goddess, you two are coming onto my ship. Huh. Havel turned about to face her, you, crazy. Nah. Drake grinned, perfect, right. The little goddess and her pal get safe passage off the island alongside a bunch of protectors and we get a labyrinth-bred bodyguard and goddess to boot as allies for our Grail hunt. Win-win situation. You do know what we are, right? The goddess looked at Drake as though she was an idiot, who he is. She gestured to Asterios with a frown. So. Drake shrugged, I got 2 walking corpses. She gestured to Ash, who frowned at her, a bishop, gesturing to Havel, ghost people, Archer and Boudica, and a couple of kids. She let out a bark of laughter as she finished. I'd say we're about as crazy a crew as it gets. What would a goddess and her bull friend be compared to that? Quote. You're a strange human, Urieli muttered under her breath as she stared at her. This is a rather sudden decision, senpai. Mash Whisper shouted to Ritsuka, it seems like something strange to fight someone and then demand their help moments later. So it's not just me, right? Ritsuka replied with a baffled look, yeah, this is rather sudden. Hey, Drake shrugged, my ship. I can be as sudden as I like. Her eyes fixed themselves back upon the goddess, what's it gonna be? Urieli stared at the woman for a few moments before looking over her shoulder at the servant behind her. Asterios, what do you say? I'll go with you, the servant ground out. Ritsuka blinked at how soft their voice sounded, lonely, alone. Quote. Fine. Urieli clicked her tongue, I suppose we'll go with you. Her eyes flickered back to Asterios, you'll have to wait until he is better though. You can't expect him to do much like this. Ash. Ritsuka whispered to the servant, think you can, heal him. Ash stared at Ritsuka with a frown before he shrugged, as you wish, although I am dubious about this arrangement. You're dubious about everything I do. Drake rolled her eyes at him, I could tell you the sky is blue and you'd argue with me. I could tell you the sun is made from gold and you'd try and steal it. Ash replied instantly with a scowl, that is why I am dubious about you. Quote. I mean, who wouldn't try and steal it? Ash let out a sigh as he approached the Minotaur, stopping a few feet from the servant and holding out his left palm. The servant tensed themselves as a golden orb floated up from the saber's hand before hanging in the air. Soon a golden hue fell upon the servant. Urieli stared at the orb before her eyes fell onto Ash and narrowed, that's not magecraft. No, it isn't. He answered in a disinterested voice, it will heal him up as best as it can. Hopefully he will be back on his feet soon enough. Urieli stared at him in silence before giving a small nod. Well, at least you know how to act when in front of a goddess. I've met many lords before. Ash blandly answered. They were also more impressive. Never mind. Urieli clicked her tongue at him, you're as rude as the others. Are you sure about this? Boudica whispered to Ritsuka with a frown. I'm all for accepting help where we can get it, but this feels foolish. Archer answered for the boy, naive. Idiotic. Quote. I was going to say risky. Boudica replied with a flat look before turning back to face Ritsuka and Mash, but he isn't wrong. Well, Ritsuka shrugged, way I see it, Captain Drake isn't exactly wrong. They need help just as much as we do. He nodded to Asterios, also it doesn't seem like bad help to get. Still, stupid, Havel turned and faced Ritsuka, tilting their heads slightly. I see, you're optimistic. Probably. Ritsuka admitted easily, but in this kind of situation you've kind of got to be, right? Difference between optimi, SM, and naivety, Havel grunted, crossing their arms and staring down at him, but your choice won't save from stupidity. Asterios rolled his arms as he slowly returned to his feet, letting out a small noise as they placed pressure on their wounded ankle and stared down at their now repaired arm. The bruises on their body slowly healing up from the miracle-based pyromancy. Their bullhead slowly shifted towards Ash, thank you. He's the one who asked me. Ash gestured to Ritsuka, thank him by taking down the field. Asterios let out a small noise, then the room they were in abruptly began to rumble and become transparent. The others let out noises of surprise as the area around them dissipated into nothing. All of them soon finding themselves stood in a regular cave. The bounded field is probably down, senpai. Mash affirmed, what now? I'd say we return to the Shi, Ritsuka made to answer before being cut off when Drake marched past him. Treasure hunting it is everyone. The woman hollered as she stared into the darkness of the cave with a wide grin on her face, let's get going. Mash blinked at her, but we've already achieved our objective, surely we should head back to. Nope. Drake cut her off with a smile, it ain't called an adventure if you stop halfway through. You've gotta see it through until the very end. It's a waste of time and will gain us nothing. Ash's cold voice called out from behind them, We're free and have other concerns to deal with which are not related to whatever flight of fancy has taken hold of you now. Ha! Drake let out a heavy sigh. Figured you'd say no, but I'm going exploring and the ship won't go without me, so. She shrugged. You can either wait or you can follow. She marched on into the darkness, but you'll never know what you're missing out on if you never seize the opportunities that present themselves. This isn't an opportunity. Ash growled, it's indolence. What's the matter, kid? Never taken the scenic route before. Drake cackles echoed around the cave. Ritska and Mash looked towards Ash and promptly winced. His expression looked almost murderous. That, Ash-san. Mash's voice cut him off. He glanced towards her as she awkwardly fidgeted on the spot. We can't really let her go alone. Ash let out a heavy sigh. Fine. He responded in a clipped tone. We'll have to follow her then. Won't we? Ritska forced a smile as he jogged after Drake. Maybe we'll find something useful. He reasoned, trying to simmer Ash's temper. Never know. Boudica was the sole exception to their group, the woman holding a patient smile as she followed after Mash and Ritska into the cave while Archer held a disinterested face as he slowly followed after them. Havel was silent as he walked past Ash, although the unkindled heard a weary sigh escape from the servant's helmet as they passed them. Ash, Asterios and Euryale remained behind for a few moments. The berserker leaned down and scooped the goddess up onto his shoulder. I suppose we are following them, no. Asterios let out a small noise of confusion in response. Unfortunately. Ash clicked his tongue. If she wasn't so important, I think I might have killed her already. Charming. Euryale drolly replied to him. Come on, Asterios. All right. The berserker nodded his head, walking past Ash and further into the cave system. Are you sure it's a good idea to antagonize Ash-san? Mash asked Drake as she caught up with her. You know he doesn't like this kind of thing. He's never tried it, so how can he say he doesn't like it? Drake rolled her eyes in response. Besides, I ain't gonna change the way I live just because of a couple of naysayers. Otherwise I'd never get anything done. But, Mash. Drake cut her off with a sigh. People like him lead sad lives. Her voice turned sour. They lead sad lives because they never see beauty in anything. Everything they do is always a job for them, so they never appreciate what the world has to offer. She shrugged. That's why we have adventures. Because it ain't always about the destination, it's about how we get there that matters just as much. She gave Mash a carefree look. Do I antagonize the guy? Probably. Do I care? Not really. Way I see it, he needs to figure out there's more to life than just a job. The woman turned away from the shielder, but that's up to him. Won't force him to do anything if he's too stubborn to accept there's more than one way of life. Mash pursed her lips and looked away from the captain. It didn't make much sense to her either. She could see that Ash was correct. They had removed the bounded field, so they should have departed as soon as they could. Yet Drake had charged off with Ritska right behind her. It was strange, but perhaps it would be a waste if they stopped halfway through their investigation of the cave. She couldn't say for certain. It also made her think of Ash. At times he seemed as clueless as she was to some things and certain behaviors. Mash wasn't ignorant. She knew she was like this because she'd had no experience with others until now. But from what she had seen, Ash had still frequently gone into the outside world and even met outgoing people like Sigurd. The fact he was still like she was. She wasn't sure how she felt about that. But she didn't think it was a good thing. And, Asterios appears. Havel tackle. I know people might complain, but bear in mind Asterios got rushed by like 5 servants, including Havel and Ash. Both of whom were experienced slayers at dealing with monsters and the sort. In a straight-up fight where he doesn't get taken by surprise, Asterios probably would have been able to do better. Just in case anyone accuses me of downplaying certain servants. The Heracles fight won't go down that easy. Not really much else to say, to be honest. We're probably going to get our first encounter with Blackbeard in the next chapter. Which is going to be tonally wild for Ash. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. More than can be chewed. You know you can give yourself wrinkles if you scowl so much. Euryale's voice sounded out to Ash's left. The unkindled released a weary sigh as he continued to march along through the cave system. Although I suppose you don't care too much about physical appearances, no. Not especially. Ash eventually replied. glancing sideways and staring at the Minotaur. So how did you come across this one anyway? Asterios. Euryale tilted her head, looking down at the berserker whose shoulder she was riding upon. I first came to the island some days ago, having been shipwrecked. I met Asterios when I was trying to explore more of the island. She shrugged. After that he clearly understood my beauty and decided to protect me. Ash gave her a bland look and then stared at the berserker, giving a single nod in response. The Knights of Karam are similar. He replied after a few moments. They'll devote themselves to the service of a single maiden their whole lives. He titled his head slightly. Now that I think about it, I believe that was based upon an apostle of a goddess of mourning. Euryale released a small hum in response, shifting herself to be more comfortable. Is that so? Although I wouldn't describe Asterios here as an apostle of mine. She paused for a few moments before staring down at the berserker. What do you think, Asterios? Protect. Euryale. The berserker replied in his unusually soft voice. All that matters. The goddess put on a satisfied smile as she pat the servant's fluffy white hair. And this is why I like you. You're very honest, aren't you? So. She turned and looked down at Ash with squinted eyes. What on earth is one of your kind doing out of Hades? You're the second one to ask me about Hades. Ash grumbled. I'm beginning to think that they might be related to death of some kind. The god or the underworld, whichever. She casually replied. Well. Or you. You certainly don't feel like a normal servant, and Asterios went into a frenzy the second you stepped foot in here. I am unkindled. Ash replied in a toneless voice, risen undead made from ashes. As for why my presence set him off, he turned to Asterios and pursed his lips. I assume it relates to my skill in dealing with foes such as him. Smell like death. Most likely. Ash quietly replied. So, what are you anyway? Monster, Asterios replied before Euryale gave him a light slap on the side of his helmet. None of that kind of talk. You're Asterios. She huffed, and that's that. Asterios let out a small noise in response as their head turned away from Euryale. His form shifted slightly, indicating some small level of joy at the comment. Ash watched the conversation for barely a few more seconds before he looked elsewhere. We've been walking through this cave for a little while now, Captain. Ritska idly commented as he kept pace with Drake. How far are we going to go? As far as it takes us. Drake replied, although my nose is telling me we ain't got that much further to go. She exclaimed with a voice full of bravado, there's bound to be something worth it further in. That seems to be a lot of confidence, Captain Drake. Mash tilted her head. What if we don't find anything? Then I've wasted everyone's time, and Chuckles is going to lord it over my head. She clicked her tongue. I'd rather not see his smug expression. Ritska tried to picture how Ash would react in his mind. He couldn't see anything close to smugness, more irritated vindication. But Drake was probably right that Ash would most certainly make a comment about it. Unfortunately, he could tell that Drake would make a comment back and then they'd break into an argument again. Shaking his head, the boy dismissed the thoughts and returned his attention to Drake. So how often have you been in caves like this before? Not that often. Drake replied in an unsure tone. Definitely been in this sort of thing more than I used to as of late, but this isn't really what I normally go for. Probably what's got me all worked up in the first place. Mash let out a small noise and then looked to Ritska. Do you think we'll find anything, Senpai? I hope so. Ritska admitted, although that's also so we can say to Ash that we got something out of this. Otherwise he'll probably be annoyed. Mash grimaced and nodded her head. Most likely. She then thought of something. What about Havel-san? The boy blinked in response, unsure of what she meant. What about him? He didn't say much about Captain Drake's sudden decision. She frowned. He's been somewhat quiet lately. Caves, Echo. The pair flinched at Havel's voice coming from directly behind them. The two whirled around to see the stone-armored berserker looming over them. Here, you. He reminded, his voice devoid of any discernible emotion. Although Ritska wasn't sure if that was better or worse for him. Well, Ritska sputtered, searching for something to say. How do you feel about waste of time? Havel cut him off, voice now containing a note of irritation. Should have left already. Don't you think we'll find anything, Havel-san? Mash asked. The helmet turned to her before shaking. Don't care, ably, worth less. Ritska cringed and looked away while Mash slowly nodded her head. The group continued on their walk through the cave before Ritska spoke up again. So, what do you think about our new allies? Goddess, and her pet. Havel tilted his head, letting out a grunt. Goddess, useless, pet, fodder, was his assessment, which had Ritska turn around and level the berserker with a small frown. I'd rather not think of him as fodder just yet. Why? We're fighting not long ago. The berserker pointed out. Why care? It was a misunderstanding. Almost got killed. Ritska flinched at the blunt counter-argument. Was going to kill. Okay, it was a violent misunderstanding. Ritska replied slowly, but, alright, if we don't have to kill people then I don't want to. That's pretty much it. He sighed. Asterios was fighting us because he thought we meant harm, so I don't really see a reason to be suspicious of him. Havel tilted his helmet at Ritska, leaning forwards as if searching for something. Fine. Ritska blinked at the curt reply. Havel brushed past him and continued further on ahead without waiting for a reply. The boy turned towards Mash and exchanged a surprised look with her before his eyes returned to Havel's back. Was expecting a bit more argument from him. Perhaps he is warming up to you, senpai. Mash provided with a slightly hopeful expression. Ritska gave a grunt and a half shrug in response. Maybe, he murmured, then looked back to Mash. So what do you think about Euryale and Asterios? Mash blinked. Me. Yeah. He nodded his head. I mean, I realize it was Captain Drake suddenly doing her own thing, but she did kind of spring it on us. He sighed, running his hand through his hair. Do you think it's a bit risky? Mash pursed her lips, remaining silent for a few moments before she shook her head. No, I don't think so. They agreed to take down the bounded field and also said they would be fine coming along with us. She gave a determined nod, so I think they will prove a big help, senpai. Ritska gave a faint laugh in response. Yeah, although we still don't know who has the Grail or where to look. He frowned, and there's the matter of whoever was chasing Euryale to begin with. He paused for a few moments before he went on. I think meeting other gods has kind of spoiled my expectations. He cringed. Mash's look of confusion encouraged him to elaborate. We've seen Farum with his dragon, Gwyndolin can do some really powerful magic, and Artemis was skilled with a bow. Mash nodded her head in understanding. Yes, although the Gorgon sisters weren't actually famous for their strength but their status as beings of worship. It was only Medusa that was famed for her strength and her ability to petrify heroes who came to the island to slay her. Ritska bobbed his head. So Medusa is probably the strongest of the sisters. That is most likely true, senpai. Mash agreed, although her form we encountered in Fuyuki was blackened in some way, so she wasn't as powerful as a normal servant at the time. She didn't look like a younger sister, did she? I don't know about that, senpai. Mash shook her head. It's like Archer-san said. Divine spirits treat physical appearances different than us. Euryale-san seems to regard herself as a goddess of beauty, so it is likely that she fixed her form in what she regards as perfect. Ritska remained silent for a few moments. Havel seemed to disagree. He did, senpai. Mash nodded her head. Euryale-san seemed quite annoyed about that. He said, Guinevere, so do you think that's Gwyndolin's sister? He asked. I think he mentioned her when we met Farum again in France, but he trailed off. A slightly awkward look came to his face. He seemed a bit. It seems to be a difficult subject for him, senpai. Mash nodded. Although he did manage to get along with Artemis-san. She pointed out, so perhaps he gets along better with divine spirits. The director's report mentioned that he seemed to get along with Steno. Oh. The pair jolted at the voice, spinning around to see Euryale staring down at them with an intrigued twinkle in her eyes while Asterios' steel bull helm stared straight ahead. So, has found someone she gets along with, has she? Her smile was sweet, which had Ritska give an involuntary shiver. Tell me more. Are you all right? Ash blinked at the sudden voice. Looking to the right of him, he saw Boudica staring at him with a slightly concerned expression on her face. I realize this isn't exactly to your liking. It isn't. Ash looked away. Normally getting distracted like this is an easy way to get lost or dead. Boudica let out a small hum in response. I can see how it might end poorly, although do you think there's much danger? We currently have no idea who is in possession of the Grail or what their intentions are with it. He replied curtly, the longer we spend rushing around on completely pointless journeys the more time the holder has to enact whatever plan they have. He grumbled, it would be best if we had just knocked her out and dragged her back to the ship. Boudica gave him a wry smile, that might not have worked out so well. No, it probably wouldn't have. He sighed, it does not make this any less irritating though. I feel as though we are being held captive by her assumed importance. Not so assumed. Boudica pointed out, she did circumnavigate the entire world. She paused for a few moments before adding on, she also one of those responsible for routing the Spanish Armada when they attempted to invade England. Ash's eyes snapped to her, his brows furrowed, she'll actually finish her military career with a rank of vice admiral. Ash stared at her for a few moments before he spoke in a quiet tone, he raised his right hand and pointed down the cave, her. Boudica gave a nod with an understanding smile. Her. But what? He frowned, she hasn't displayed a single hint of interest in anything other than treasure. No, she hasn't. Boudica admitted, and there's a good probability that she'll keep that trait the rest of her life, but I suppose there is some sense of duty. She paused for a few moments before giving an unashamed shrug, although I am a little biased considering she's from Britain and defended it from invaders. Ash turned away from Boudica and stared down the tunnel, a frown coming to his lips. She has a sense of duty, but rarely displays it. The frown curled further, I cannot decide if that has improved my opinion of her or lessened it. It was something that now gnawed at his mind. If what the writer said was true, then apparently the captain was not simply a creature of greed but did have some fleeting instinct for duty. Although the fact that she seemed to actively ignore it as of late made it very difficult to decide whether it was better to have a sense of duty but ignore it, or to never have one to begin with and just be motivated by indulgence. Knew it. Drake's cheerful voice echoed out through the caves. Ash released a grumble as he picked up his pace into a gentle jog so as to catch up. Drake stood proudly with her hands on her hips as the others all gathered around her in a small clearing. Several other exits lined the walls while in the center of the room lay an olden wooden chest with an unclipped rusted iron padlock and a similarly aged chain hanging from the left side of the box. The other servants, along with Ritska, soon filed into the clearing with Drake leveling a smug expression towards Ash, waving her hand towards the chest, told you we'd find something. She tapered off and raised an eyebrow at Ash's expression, who was now glaring at the chest as if it had personally wronged him in some capacity. She frowned, I know you don't like the idea of me being right, but the treasure didn't do anything to you. It's not that. Ash denied, still frowning at the wooden chest as he walked towards it slowly, his right hand moving to the grip of Storm Ruler on his back. It's just that. I have this feeling. Oi. Drake crossed her arms, no hitting the treasure with a sword. The woman then paused before turning her eyes back on it. Although it is pretty convenient that there's just a treasure chest in the middle of the room. Her eyes darted around, not traps anywhere or something, right? That's a thing. Ritska blinked in surprise, I thought that only happened in movies. It's not unusual. Archer commented from his side, especially with the placing of this thing, it's probably best we leave it be so as to not risk it. Drake stared at it long and hard for a few moments, I'm gonna risk it. I wouldn't. Ash warned, I really wouldn't. Drake gave him a grin, where there's risk there's reward, right? There's also pain, he quickly replied as he stopped next to her, and possible death. Emerald eyes darted back down to the box. I'm with Archer, I say we leave it be. You're missing that explorer's attitude. Drake chided, moving her boot so as it rested atop the lid of the chest in a position where a kick would fling it open. What if we leave it and there's something really valuable inside? What if we open it and it's a mimic? Ash blurted out, a haunted look in his eyes, it's best not to risk it. What's a mimic? Ritska asked Mash. The girl gave a shrug in response. Nasty, little, shits, Havel grunted as he approached the chest, going so far as to materialize his own club. His entire attention was also focused on the chest, before stopping a few feet from it. Step back, he rested his left hand on the grip and hefted the club above his head. All, check. Hey, Drake span around, waving her arms with an affronted look on her face. Don't go swinging that at treasure chests. What if you destroy whatever's in it? Better, than, mimic, Havel grunted in response. The stone helmet turned to Ash and gave him a single nod. Ash returned the gesture and drew his own sword, holding it with both hands so as it was directly pointed at the chest in case it reacted. You two are being paranoid. Drake rolled her eyes, it's a treasure chest. She kicked the lid open, what's the worst that cool? The chest exploded into movement, instantly sprouting arms and legs and shooting up so it was stood over 5 meters in height, easily towering over Asterios, who recoiled in shock while Euryale let out a surprised cry. While the arms appeared to be comically spindly in comparison with the rest of its body, that didn't detract from the fact they were still as thick as any of the normal servant's legs. The lid of the chest was forced ajar, rows of sharpened dagger-like teeth jutted from the rims and moved around towards the hinges. From inside, 2 pale arms with clawed hands revealed themselves as the body hunched over. From beneath the actual trunk was the presumed body, an emaciated humanoid shape with no discernible features otherwise. Ash was the first to react, Drake still paralyzed with shock as the mimic swung its clawed hands towards her. The saber roughly shoved her to the ground with his right hand at the same time he swung Storm Ruler towards the knees with his left. The pale-clawed fingers stabbed into his shoulders before the blade could hit the beast. The saber's eyes widened as the mimic charged forwards at the same time it lifted him into the air, barely having enough time to let out a shout before it stuffed the top half of his body into its mouth and the lid clamped down. Ash's muffled cry of pain seemingly jolted everyone else into action. Havel charged towards the mimic and swung towards its legs. The mimic performed a perfect roundhouse kick and slammed its heel into the side of the berserker's helmet with enough force to snap his head to the side and send him tumbling away, all the while Ash's legs were flailing around inside the mouth, before it charged forwards. Boudica let out a muffled gasp of surprise before she raised her small shield as the mimic swung its leg back until its body was parallel to the ground, suspended on its single leg, and then launched it forwards in a powerful kick. The foot smashed into the shield and lifted the rider off her feet, briefly letting out a grunt as she slammed into the roof of the cavern and fell back down to the ground. Mash! Ritska cried out, get his legs. Archer, go for the joints. He managed to order through the chaos as the mimic continued to chew on their saber, who was still letting out a muffled shout from inside the mimic, as it span around. Mash adhered to the order and charged the monster. The mimic span on its heel and raised its right leg high, performing a full 360 maneuver and crashed its offending limb into the center of Mash's shield. The lilac-haired girl grit her teeth at the surprising force behind the attack. Archer charged towards the raised leg and swung Kancho upwards, slashing across the back of its heel and causing the creature to let out a growl of pain as it attempted to retreat. Ash's muffled cry turned into a shout as the hinges of the wooden jaw began to creak as the slowly tried to pry the mouth open. The mimic hobbled backwards as it tried to find a new avenue or attack. Havel's armored fist impacted its left knee, the joint released a sickening crack as it bent at an awkward angle. Without any ability to stand correctly, the mimic fell onto its knees as the interior of its mouth began to glow. Ritska widened his eyes as he realized what was about to happen. Take cover. He shouted out. Mash leapt in front of him with her shield raised as the other servants took a step back, Archer dragging Drake away. The top half of the mimic was consumed in a ball of fire. The bright orange flames burned away at the wooden body and dry skin. The mimic released harrowing screams as Ash pulled himself free of its mouth. He stamped down onto the bottom jaw with his right boot and thrust his left hand, still glowing bright with a pyromancy, into the gap in the back of its head and pulled. There was a groaning of metal before the jaw gave way, Ash ripping it from the top of its body and carelessly hurling it away from him. He raised Storm Ruler, pulling it backwards before thrusting it towards the soft pink flesh inside. The blade instantly skewered itself through the body and buried itself into the rocky ground beneath. Ash abruptly twisted the sword with crunch before ripping it free of the corpse. The saber remained stationary for a few moments before he raised his left hand like a claw and thrust it into the body. Ritska grimaced at the noises before Ash ripped something free of it. A glittery-looking metallic crystal around the width of a small melon now lay in his palm. Ash took a single step back and slowly turned his head to stare at Drake. The woman's expression was still slightly ajar as she tried to compute the last 30 seconds that had just occurred. He raised the rock up so she could see it and spoke only 3 words, "I'm keeping this." Drake mutely nodded her head before Ash turned to Ritska, his expression still set in an irritated scowl. That was a mimic. Oh, Ritska swallowed. Let's avoid chests in the future. Ash grunted, at the very least. His eyes fell on Drake again. Wait until we've checked them first. His voice contained a hint of barely restrained anger. Ash-san, Mash timidly called out, are you alright? Do you need to heal yourself? Ash's head turned to her before his eyes fell down upon him. He frowned as he stared at the neat line of holes which had cleanly punctured through his armor and into his body. Cold dark blood slowly leaked from them. He clicked his tongue. I am not that injured. His anger died away and left only an exhausted frown. I almost forgot how much I hate mimics. Dead, now, Havel grunted, kicking the burning corpse for good measure before his helmet's attention fell onto the glowing rock in Ash's hand. Twin. Cling. Tita. Knight. Ash nodded, raising his prize up with an aggrieved look. As unfortunate as it is to admit, this is useful. Before he lowered his hand and moved it towards his bottomless box. For now, let's just go. Why yeah, Ritsuka numbly nodded his head, eyes darting between the burning corpse and Ash. Think that might be enough treasure hunting, right Captain? Probably. Drake admitted as she climbed to her feet, dusting herself down. Well, thank you for the save. I'm more durable than you. Ash replied, still looking down at his bottomless box as he deposited the twinkling titanite within it, and whatever else, you are still important enough that protecting you is a given. His head raised itself and he sent a pointed expression towards her, don't do it again. I didn't think it would try and eat me. Drake exclaimed, throwing her hands up, how was I supposed to expect that? Because you're a mimic's favorite prey. Ash scoffed, the type who'll leap at opportunity to acquire treasure. Clicking his tongue, he turned away. There is a reason that greed is not commonly practiced where I come from. It more often than not gets you killed. Ash turned on his heel without waiting for a reply and marched towards the nearest exit, quickly disappearing into the darkness and leaving all the other servants behind. Well, Drake let out a sigh, that was my bad right there, probably got a bit too excitable. The continued voyage throughout the cave system was far more somber. The sudden attack by the mimic and its surprising show of strength had left everyone on edge more so than they had been. Drake especially was paying close attention to the corners. Ritsuka, however, was still concerned about Ash. Giving Mash a small parting, he jogged towards the front of the small exploratory party, passing by Drake as he did so, and quickly caught sight of the back of the saber, a torch held in his left hand and illuminating their way forwards. Ritsuka quickly closed the gap between the two of them and fell into step alongside the servant. Ash's eyes briefly glanced down for a few moments before they returned to their original direction, the two remaining in a comfortable silence before the unkindled eventually spoke up. Are you still concerned about my health, Ritsuka? A little bit, he replied with his attention now drawn to the puncture marks along his chest and back. Sure you're alright. A mimic can do far more damage than this. Ash gestured with his free hand towards the wounds. I suppose we can count ourselves fortunate that none of us died. Right, so that was something from your world. Ritsuka inquired with a disturbed expression, was everything like that? Out to kill you? Ash gave a half shrug, yes. Mimics are horrible but as long as you can recognize them they are easily countered. He paused for a few moments as a grimace came to him, but they can be in possession of useful materials. Like the glowing rock. Ash gave a single nod, twinkling titanite. The metal of the gods, he explained. Whoa, sounds useful. Ritsuka hummed, so would you say it paid off? A grumbled sigh was his answer. In part. However, that did not make it any less risky for us. I've seen a mimic kill a demon, they are formidable and we are fortunate to have outnumbered it so. The master nodded his head lightly in response. You're still angry, aren't you? Angry. Ash frowned. I'm irritated but we have been able to gain something out of this venture, so it is not a wasted effort. His expression reverted to a more passive one. I already have some titanite but having surplus in case of an emergency is always practical. Ritsuka furrowed his brows at Ash. Is that, are you actually okay with this? Ash shrugged. I still believe we should have returned to the ship after having the fog wall taken down, however this venture has not been as pointless as it could have been. Pursing his lips, he gave a single nod. Perhaps it will also be valuable experience for Drake to not carelessly open chests in the future, or teach her that ventures such as this can very easily end in death. A learning experience then, I suppose so. Ash admitted, although it was rather tame for a learning experience, given the lack of dying, but the message remains the same. Despite this, I am dubious as to whether it will stick. Ritska stared at Ash in silence for a few moments before he eventually decided to voice the question brewing in his head. Ash, if we hadn't gotten anything from this, would you be angry? It would have meant we would have wasted valuable time on nothing. Ash replied instantly, we would have gained nothing as well. Despite the unnecessary fight with the mimic, we have obtained something we can use and therefore this was not a meaningless endeavor. He shrugged, that's really all I can say about it. The master's eyes squinted at Ash with his face slowly morphing into a conflicted expression. Something about that reasoning didn't sound right to him. What Ash had said wasn't wrong, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something about it which wasn't correct. Did they get something out of this? They did, but Ritska felt as though there had to be more than their exploration than just getting something and calling it a day. How long do you think they'll be? David asked as he looked down at Oscar. The man released a quiet hum as he stared at his fishing line going over the side of the ship. I've not much experience in exploration, he admitted with a self-depreciating chuckle. My first true adventure lasted for barely a month before I went hollow. I was not of great skill either, so perhaps it was also my own shortcomings which lengthened it. David remained silent for a few moments before he looked over towards the sea. Have you managed to catch anything yet? Not as of yet, no. Oscar replied without much in the way of annoyance at his lack of success. It was closer to resignation, although I feel as though a burden has been lifted over my shoulders as of late. Yes, if I were to hazard a guess I would say that whatever was keeping the ship stuck here is gone. The ancient king stated, that is good news, I should imagine they will return soon. I should like to believe so. Oscar commented, all accounted for as well, it has been some time since I had sane company and would rather not lose it. I'm sure we'll be fine. David reassured with a carefree tone, it's a voyage on the sea with a famous ship captain and myself as a humble shepherd. There's very little that can go wrong. Oscar's head turned to look at the man over his shoulder. I do not wish to cause offense to you, but I am still surprised you are a king. Really? David blinked, then frowned. Well, I was a shepherd first and the two roles aren't that different from each other. I believe they are. Oscar looked him up and down, are they not? They both involve guiding your flock. David shrugged. Both man and animals have a plan within God's design and be it a shepherd of either, you still work towards fulfilling it. I trust that everything I do is in accordance with God's will and for me, that is enough. Oscar hummed, I envy this singular confidence you have that all your actions are fulfilling in some way. You are certainly less overbearing than some of the clerics in Astora. He paused for a few moments, do not tell Bishop Havel of this. Ha ha ha. David gave a boisterous laugh in response. He's a reasonable man once you get to know him, an odd fascination with mages to be sure but not a terrible one. His laughter died down. In truth, it is probably best he does not know more of my legend as well. Truly. Well, my successor was a mage as well, you know. His expression softened, a good one too as I'm led to believe. Most people know him as a king though. He waved his hand, looking up and staring across the horizon, just one of those things. Looking back at it now, I didn't think he could have been anything other than a king. It must be rewarding, to have your life so cleanly laid before you. Oscar sighed, I am quite envious. I do not know if I ever truly had a fate. Is it rewarding? David blinked. I like to think that some of the most rewarding parts of life are discovering God's plan as you go, but I was a different sort of person and so was he. Are you proud of him? Proud of him? David frowned. Pride? Well, they say pride is a sin. But I am glad he built the temple to God. So I'm proud of the achievement. He tilted his head. As for pride in his kingship. Well, I don't know if I could have pride in it because I don't think he did either. He shrugged, that's neither here nor there though. I did my thing and Solomon did his. Oscar stared at him for a few moments before he released a small huff of amusement. My father once told me that to take pride in another man's work is conceited. I suppose you're similar enough. He paused, then again, he was a fisherman. Simple trade. David smiled. See, we wise men all have humble beginnings. Although I wonder if I'm special. And there it goes. Oscar released an amused breath. Well, you have a better sense of humor at least. Thanks. David pat him on the back, then looked over the side. I think you have a bite. His head nodded down to the water surface. Oscar followed his gaze and saw his fishing line begin to bob and move, creating ripples beneath it. So I do. Oscar's lip slowly curved into a faint smile. I had feared my skill gone for good. It's like herding sheep. David dismissed, although it will go a lot better if you listen to my exact instructions. How much longer do you intend to spend in this dreary place? Euryale gave a weary sigh. It is ill-befitting of a goddess. Weren't you here first? Boudica sent her a flat look. The goddess responded with one of her own. I was inside the labyrinth. There is a marked difference between something with a sense of architecture behind it and a musty cave. She frowned, resting her hands on Asterios' helmet and patting it down. If it weren't for Asterios being so helpful as to carry me, I'd have to dirty my feet walking along the floor alongside the rest of you. How terrible, Havel grunted as he walked past her. The complete lack of emotion in his voice caused the girl to let out an indignant noise. Honestly, it's as if Asterios here is the only one who truly appreciates a goddess. Euryale pouted, crossing her arms, although I am quite curious as to the one whom seemed to get along with me. Her smile turned more mischievous. I wonder. Gwyndolin, certainly an interesting name. Havel briefly stopped, looking over his shoulder at the girl for a few moments before he turned away and continued his walk. The reaction was not missed by the goddess, whose eyes instantly narrowed in suspicion at the berserker and a sly smile formed upon her lips. Do you perhaps know the name of the god? Long time ago, Havel replied, doesn't matter. I should think it matters. Euryale cooed, after all, he's apparently enamored with me. She paused, not that I blame him, after all. The beauty of me and myself is truly special. Perhaps it takes a god to understand true beauty after all. Havel's helmet turned to her. The berserker stared up at her for a few moments before a quiet scoff of incredulity escaped his helmet and he turned away. Whatever, his clear dismissal had the goddess frown at him, her eyes dulling over before letting out a huff of her own and looking away. Boudica watched the conversation with morbid curiosity before she leaned towards Archer at her side. He's very casual about meeting a god, isn't he? Considering he has history with the gods, I would be more surprised if he showed a reaction at all. Archer dryly replied, I imagine he just doesn't care. Boudica hummed, still, what about you? Considering we've already been burgled by the goddess Artemis and we have another moon god who occasionally patrols Chaldea, there isn't much to be surprised by the appearance of another god. He shrugged, if what I've heard is also true, they encountered a war god in France on both occasions they went there. The tanned servant let out a resigned sigh. At this point I should think we'll have to get used to the notion of meeting divine spirits. I suppose that's true. The writer admitted before a thoughtful look came to her face. I wonder if I'll be able to give proper thanks to the goddess Andraste. Archer's face looked as though he'd sucked a lemon. I'd rather keep encounters with divine spirits to a minimum, considering how most legends involving them normally end with someone being cursed or dying. He nodded towards Euryale and Asterios, take those two for example. Boudica sighed, I realize they aren't always the best ends, but it would still be something I would be truly grateful for. Looking back down the tunnel, a warm smile came to her, if only because she granted me her blessing to fight the Romans, despite the fact I did fail she still bestowed her favor upon me. HMPH. Archer grunted in response, do as you will. Ash paused, holding his right hand up and causing those behind him to stop. What is it? Ritska asked him, feeling a sense of worry enter him as the saber seemingly stared into nothing ahead of them. Can you feel that? Ash asked. The master blinked before he went to answer. Before he could provide an answer, he felt something tickle the side of his face. His head turned away from Ash and faced the direction they had been walking. I can feel a breeze. Ritska widened his eyes, that means we're almost out. Indeed. Ash nodded his head, come, once we are free of these tunnels we can make out way back to the ship. Emerald eyes briefly glanced at Ritska. I admit, I am curious as to how you will explain this detour to Olga. Ritska's expression froze, his eyes glassing over as Ash raised a very good point. It was very good point and he, rather unfortunately, was left without a means of answering that at the present time. The director would probably be more than unhappy at the detour and not immediately contacting her. His mind already went to work in trying to figure out an excuse. Senpai. Mash's concern from behind him brought his attention to the shielder standing behind him. Are you alright? Ask me again after we contact Chaldea. Ritska cringed, unless, he trailed off, looking towards Ash. Hey, how valuable is that titanite stuff? Twinkling titanite was the rarest that could be found. Ash replied before raising an eyebrow. Do you intend to use it curry favor with Olga? Do you think it would work? Ash shrugged. I never found a use for it aside from reinforcing my weapons, but if you believe she might be able to find an alternative use for it, then I do not see the harm. I still have more mundane titanite within my box of varying sizes. That's not an answer. Ritska replied with a slightly pleading expression at this point. We all face the consequences of irrelevant actions in different ways. Ash replied with a perfect mask of an expression. For Drake it was the mimic, for you. He let out a quiet hum. I cannot say, it depends on how pleased Olga is with the materials and if she can find a use for them. That sounds quite. Mash struggled to find the correct words for a few moments before replying. Cold. She decided on, although I do agree with him, senpai. Ritska shot her a slightly betrayed look which had her flinch. Well. The director might not be happy we didn't immediately contact her. Ritska's shoulders slumped. I know, at least Roman will be on my side, right? I do not know if that is an achievement you should boast of. The girl frowned. Dr. Roman is quite absent-minded at times. She squinted her eyes ahead of her. I think, they widened before a relieved smile came to her face. I can see light, senpai. That the way out then? Drake's voice echoed out behind them. The sounds of footsteps soon followed as the woman closed in. Ash took a single step to his left to allow her to walk past him. She sported an oddly impassive expression upon her face. Giving a single nod, she jerked her head towards the faint glimmer of light towards the end of the tunnel. Well, looks like our adventure is almost over then, Ash grunted and soon began walking ahead of the captain, so it seems. With luck we will not be far from the shoreline, so our journey towards the ship is not arduous. Drake pursed her lips and gave a single shrug. Well, that's the response I was expecting, to be honest. She turned to Mash and cracked a smile. Come on kid, my instinct is kicking in again. Ritska paled. Is it the same as last time? The captain cackled, slapping the boy on the back and sending him stumbling forwards. Nah. Nothing like that. This is my instinct that says, something good will happen. There's an instinct for that. Mash inquired with a downright awe-filled expression. That's amazing, Captain Drake. Hee hee. Giving another short laugh, she ventured on ahead of the two of them. Come on then. Gradually picking up the pace until she was in a fast-paced walk while not quite being a jog. I got a good feeling. Ash heard her footsteps gradually getting louder behind him before he stepped aside, allowing Drake to pass him with her usual expression of mirth. His own face remained blank as she passed him. He craned his head back to see Ritska and Mash soon follow after her and moving past himself as well. Letting out a weary sigh, he picked up his own pace as well so as to keep up with the two of them. The light at the end of the tunnel gradually grew in size, intensifying as they approached with the strength of the breeze picking up into a gentle current accompanied by a quiet whistling sound of wind. Drake was the first to clear the mouth of the cave, instantly being bathed in light as she came to a halt at the foot of a small drop further down into the island. The woman paused and stared straight ahead, her hands moving down to rest on her hips as her expression softened. The sounds of Ritska and Mash's arrival soon followed, the boy sounding far more out of breath than the shielder. Which was to be expected, although still not panting. The master paused as his vision cleared, his eyes growing accustomed to the sudden change in lighting, and his breath caught in his throat. Arms falling limply by his sides as he slowly moved towards where Drake was stood. Mash herself had all but frozen and remained so long after the other servants had emerged from the cave and moved to stand outside. Her eyes were still transfixed on the sight that lay before her. Old be getting through now. Ritska blinked at the sudden voice, mutely aware that he was raising his wrist and pressing down on the button. Ah, Fujimaru-kun. Roman's relieved voice echoed through the speaker. Thank goodness. We were worried when we lost contact with you, but... Roman, Ritska cut him off quietly. Can you just be quiet for a few moments? Roman's voice almost cracked as Ritska activated the holographic screen. What do you... Oh. The master spanned the projection around so as to give the command center the same view. Wow. Hey, Mash. Drake called back to the shielder, turning around and giving her a lopsided smile. How good would you say my instinct was? Mash didn't reply, still staring ahead of herself towards the horizon. The sun was already halfway set with the gentle orange rays being reflected by the expanse of ocean which seemed to go on forever. With barely a cloud in the sky there was nothing to obscure the view from them. It was almost as if a painting had come to life. For Mash, it had been the first time she had ever seen something like this in person. Seeing pictures was one thing, but to see a sunset like this and feel the gentle breath of the wind against her skin was something else entirely. "Senpei," Mash quietly called out. Ritsuka slowly turned his head towards her. The shielder's lips traced themselves into an awe-filled smile. "I'm glad we could stop to see this." Ritsuka's own lips quirked upwards at her reaction, giving her a slow nod as he cast his sight back across the horizon. Drake watched her reaction with faint glint of softness on her face before her eyes fell onto the others, most of whom were watching the sunset with varied expressions of awe themselves. Save Havel and Archer. The former was hidden behind his helm and the latter still held that blank expression on his face although his shoulders had relaxed themselves considerably. Then her eyes fell to Ash. The Saber's eyes were upon the sunset without even a hint of emotion in them. Ash himself stared at it for a few moments, his lips drawn into a thin line, before he looked around towards everyone else and finally falling onto Mash's expression. Her own face full of wonder which he had not seen present in the young girl before, as if she had found something. For the life of him, he could not understand what they saw in the sunset. He was a warrior of sunlight so he gave praise to the sun but it was always something that gave him meaning. As long as the sun rose, there would always be a tomorrow. He knew he lacked the same devotion as Solaire. He could tell that when he first met the Saber. Had that man been here now, Ash wasn't sure what he would do. Still, he was glad that Mash had found something in the sun's rays. Like a warm father indeed, he thought to himself as he crossed his arms, completely missing the almost pitiful look that Drake was sending him as she turned away. Well, Drake crossed her arms, we should probably get going, no? Ritsuka gave a gentle hum as reply, yeah. Someone got a picture of this, right? Roman whispered to the control room. Don't worry, I got it. Carrie's voice came through soon after, anyone want a copy or am I printing this thing out? Depends on if the director even lets us use the printer. Roman replied, I don't think we have much in the way of spare ink. Fair enough. David and Oscar stared at the new arrivals with unblinking expressions for a few moments before their eyes moved away from Asterios and Euryale and towards the rest of the servants. And Drake. With equal looks of bewilderment. David's expression soon morphed into one of amusement. I know that you can find some interesting things while going exploring, he chuckled, leveling his hand in the direction of the two new servants. I wasn't quite expecting this. I confess, this development is a shock to me as well. Oscar murmured, staring at Euryale with an expression of pure awe. You're truly a goddess? I am indeed. Euryale nodded with a smug look upon her face. You are clearly ensnared by my beauty, no? Well, Oscar fidgeted, soon taking his helmet out from under the crook of his arm and placing it back atop his head. His voice cracked slightly as he turned away from them. Make sure the ship is well cleaned. New crew members too. Right. He shuffled away, casting one final glance over his shoulder at the pair before darting off. Euryale watched the reaction with visible satisfaction before turning her head towards the others. That is the type of reaction you should have when in the presence of one such as I. She smirked, clearly he and Asterios are the only ones who recognize my true beauty. Yeah. Drake dismissively waved. You're pretty as a peach, whatever you say. The woman stopped in the center of the ship and soon shouted out, raise the sails, we're setting off away from here. Aye, Captain. The crew hollered back before Drake turned around to stare at Euryale and Asterios. Gotta find something new to and do now. Her eyes fell on Euryale and frowned. Well, you're a bit too small for much physical labor. Don't think you'd be much good at it either. Are you suggesting that a goddess such as myself should dirty her hands in the muck alongside this rabble? Euryale spoke with an indignant tone. I am to be worshipped like the pillar of beauty that I am, not seen scrubbing floors in. Okay. Drake pinched the bridge of her nose and let out a sigh. Well, you can be our good omen then. She decided on, I'm sure you can bless our voyage or something, right? If it's blessing you're after, I will require appropriate worship. She leaned back into her throne of white fluffy hair with a coy smile. But I'm sure you can manage something of that caliber, no? She then paused as she realized something. Her eyes snapping down to Ritska. Ah yes. I can speak with the god who became enamored with me, now can't I? Huh? Ritska blinked, his head snapping up to Euryale and mouth forming an O shape. You want to talk with Gwendolyn? Yes. Alright then. Ritska muttered, pressing the communicator on his wrist. Roman? The doctor's face appeared on the screen. The man looked up from whatever was on the monitor to his left and towards Ritska. Is there something wrong, Fujimaru-kun? Not really, he replied, it's just that Euryale. Romani released a violent cough. What? Another goddess? What? Ritska winced at the director's high-pitched scream that came off from the doctor's left. The woman soon appeared onto the screen and pushed Romani out of the way and fixing her wide eyes onto Ritska. You've encountered another divine spirit. Why yes. Ritska nodded his head quickly, Euryale of the Gore. I know that. Olga sharply cut him off before composing herself. I suppose your lack of communication for the last hour can be explained if you were dealing with a goddess. She frowned as she looked him over. You don't appear injured and I know that Dr. Romani would have made me aware of anything of the like. Pursing her lips, a sudden thought came to mind. I assume the goddess is with you now? Yeah, Ritska absently nodded his head, looking up towards Euryale and Asterios. We managed to get her help and the help of her friend. Friend? Olga raised an eyebrow, another servant? Yep. Ritska replied, turning back to the director and giving her a smile, his name is Asterios. The Minotaur. Ritska winced, once again, at the volume of the scream, are you? Hey, Euryale shouted down at the director. At the very least call Asterios by his name. He is my guardian and therefore deserves some common decency. Huh? Olga sputtered, wah. Her eyes snapped back to Ritska. Well, I suppose having the Minotaur from the labyrinth would be a valuable ally. She frowned. Have you discovered any clues relating to the Holy Grail yet? Not as of late. Ritska shook his head. Although we did encounter a monster from Ash's world, he cheerfully exclaimed with a strained look. Olga gave him a raised eyebrow, standing up straight and cupping her chin. Perhaps the link between the two worlds is growing stronger, she muttered under her breath. It's not impossible. Romani chimed in. The other singularities drew in creatures of mystical origin that should have long since departed the world, even in the time period you're in. He shrugged. Perhaps the Grail in this era is drawing them in as well. It is certainly something we'll have to watch out for. The doctor's eyes fell on Ritska as he pulled his chair forwards. What can you tell us about the creature you encountered? It was disguised as a treasure chest. Ritska replied with a distant look. Moment the lid came off, it sprouted arms and legs. Also the lid was a big mouth. Well that's, Romani blinked. That seems really horrible. Kind of the worst monster a pirate could ever encounter now that I think about it. He paused for a few moments. What about combat-wise? It tried to eat Ash. Ooh, Romani cringed. Is he alright? Yeah, Ritska nodded. Well, we did get it. Although it was a lot quicker than I thought it would be. He frowned. Ash called them a mimic. With a natural disguise I can see why. Romani nodded his head. You'll have to be more careful of treasure chests in the future. Fujimaru-kun. He replied with a tone of absolute seriousness. Or not go opening chests at random. Olga dryly replied. So, what else did you have to report? Well, Euryale wanted to speak with Gwendolyn. Ritska explained. She says she wants to meet the person who got along with her sister. Romani and Olga stared at him, then looked at each other and then back to Ritska. You called us, so she could speak with Gwendolyn? Yes. And not because you wanted to tell us about your encounter with a phantasmal being from another world? When you put it like that, the master muttered under his breath. So, where is Gwendolyn? Romani sighed, spinning around in his chair and rolling it towards another desk. I'll call him. Olga continued to stare at Ritska blankly for a few moments before speaking again. Your priorities are disturbing skewered. She spoke with a dead tone. Anything else? We found something Ash calls, Metal of the Gods. Of course you did. Olga grumbled as she pinched her nose, and of course it's apparently nothing but a mere afterthought at this point. Sorry, don't, she cut herself off with a loud sigh, just keep searching for the Grail. Alright. Ritska gave a small nod, we'll let you know if we encounter anything else. The screen shut off. Ritska remained stationary for a few moments before looking up at Urieli, who was still staring expectantly, and gave her a half-smile. They're just getting him now. HMPH. So, David came to a stop next to Havel. His face in a mirthful smile, first impressions of another god? Pity. Full, Havel grunted without looking down at the man. Tiny. Girl. Like. Doll. I imagine that's probably the point. David admitted. There is an ethereal nature to her beauty that can't really be matched by other women. He paused for a few moments, aside from Abishag, of course. He shrugged. I can see how some might be tempted to fall for her. Havel paused in his work, slowly craning his head towards the man. B.U.T.Y.? The berserker's voice was incredulous as he stared at the archer, then looked over to Urieli and then back to the archer. Bit young, no? David stared at the berserker. She's got to be thousands of years old. He pointed out, she probably looks good for her age. 15,000 years, he replied. David paused and stared at Havel with wide eyes. Oh, should I refer to you as an honored elder? I joke. David let out a laugh, while also taking a single step away from the berserker, and raised his hands in surrender. But man, that's quite the surprise. Although considering I can feel a sliver of divinity from you, I imagine that might be it. He cupped his chin. Still, I am a servant of God first and foremost, and I won't be tempted by any other divinity. He nodded his head. I am loyal only to Abishag. Havel continued to stare at him in silence for a few moments before slowly looking away from the archer, staring down at the cannon in front of him and then moving his hand towards the cloth he was using to polish it. Ow, right. A full-on lord, Oscar still muttered to himself. It's never in my wildest fantasies could I ever have imagined meeting one. Ash stared at him, then furrowed his brows. I suppose? He frowned, although I imagine you never encountered one before. No, Oscar shook his head. I was only a recent arrival into Lordran and was unable to spend much more than a week there before I lost myself to the curse. He let out a disbelieving chuckle. It is. I still cannot believe there is one here. The unkindled shrugged his shoulders as he moved towards the swords on the rack. I have met more impressive gods. But they were different, I suppose. He admitted, they were either lords of Cinder or of Gwyn's family. Oscar paused and looked towards Ash. Why? You met those who linked the fire and those of Lord Gwyn's family? He whispered in shock before breaking into a louder laugh. Ha 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 ha. I can imagine this is quite the common event for you. No? The laugh died down as the man turned away. To think you lived such a storied life. I am jealous, I admit. It is nothing to be jealous over. Ash sighed. Besides, her purpose appears to be better suited towards idol worship. Oscar blinked once before nodding his head, like the goddess Guinevere then. Releasing a hum, the man went about polishing the swords. Yes, that makes sense. What of the creature with you? His name is Asterios. Ash replied. The unkindled shrugged. I'm told he is a minotaur. What is a minotaur? I do not know. The early rays of dawn and gentle breeze were soon signaled by the awakening of crew members. The master was one of the first onto the deck, stretching his arms out before he moved up towards the top of the ship, near where Drake was steering the ship, having awoken earlier, before coming to a halt at the top of the stairs. Do we have a new heading, Captain? Drake shrugged. Don't know. She sighed. Been quiet waters since we picked up those two yesterday. Haven't spotted anything so far. We'll probably have to sail around until we spot another island. She grimaced. Or we could end up running into him. Him? Ritska blinked, tilting his head slightly. Who's him? An asshole. She grumbled. Been harassing me and my boys for a little over a week before your lot arrived. Been able to avoid him often enough, but he keeps turning up when you don't want to see him. Ritska frowned. Do you think we'll be in trouble? The woman paused, her lips pulling into a tight frown. Hard to say. Until you arrived I've been trying to escape confrontations with him. Her eyes snapped to Ritska before her mouth pulled itself into a confident smile. But now I got crew such as yourselves, I'd say we'd manage to send him running. The master released a barely amused breath from his lips, shaking his head and turning away to move down the stairs. Master. He stopped when he heard Archer's voice in his head, looking up towards the crow's nest where the servant had assumed the position as lookout. I think there might be trouble. What do you mean? Ritska frowned. What do you see? A ship in the distance to the aft starboard. Around 2 kilometers out. The servant replied with an edge in his voice. It's moving fast too. Even if it had the wind on its side, the speed it's traveling isn't possible without some method of enhancement. Ritska felt his blood run cold. A servant? Most likely. You should alert the captain and ready the other servants. Got it. He replied, good work, Archer. Don't thank me for doing my job. The servant's dry voice came back. I still can't clearly make out the crew, but I shall inform you of further developments. Ritska released a small snort before turning around and facing Drake. Captain. Archer says he's spotted a ship closing in on us. Drake scowled. What direction? Aft starboard. TCH. She clicked her tongue. Closing fast, I'm guessing. Yeah. Great, she grumbled. All hands to attention. She bellowed out. Man the guns. We've got a clipper coming up on our aft starboard. The crew instantly bolted into action, frantically running around as Drake scowled. Open water too, and not a cloud in the sky. She hissed, damn. Bet you're feeling really clever this time, scallywag. She grumbled under her breath. Tell that Archer bloke to keep the ship in sight. She ordered Ritska. The master gave single nod and darted down the stairs. Oscar and Ash paused as they heard a heavy commotion coming from the decks above them. The pair of sabers frowned before they looked to each other. That is not the sound of good news. Oscar grimly spoke, I fear, as though something is happening. Quite so. Ash frowned, setting down the sword he was polishing and moving to the door. Let's move. Indeed. The undead followed after him. The pair of sabers quickly making their way above deck just in time to see the crew members all rushing to prepare the cannons alongside the ship, with Havel, Boudica and David all doing their best to provide help where they could. As for Euryale and Asterios, the former held a look of resignation on her face while the latter remained stationary. Ash-san, Oscar-san, Mash called out to the pair, bringing their attention towards her. We've got a ship closing in on us fast. Not just any ship. Roman's voice popped up as he rematerialized the screen next to her, his expression set in a heavy frown. Looking at these readings, I'm sensing at least half a dozen servants approaching you. Such a tightly knit together group as well. He frowned. It means prepare yourselves for combat. Olga cut off his musings. Mash, protect your master. Her eyes turned to Ash. You two should make ready to fight as well. Francis Drake is the holder of the Grail and as such can at least hold her own against some servants, but it only goes so far. Keep Captain Drake alive then. Oscar surmised. I shall endeavor to see this duty completed. You have my word, milady. All right. Olga stuttered, slightly caught off guard by the tone he used before composing herself again. Understood. Her eyes fell onto Ash. The saber remained silent for some time before he gave a small nod in response. Satisfied, Olga pressed a button and the screen disappeared. Closing on as fast, Drake muttered to herself, then looked to Ritska. How good is Archer at shooting things? He paused. Archer, how skilled are you at shooting things? I'm an archer, master. The servant dryly responded. Given my class, I would hope to exhibit some modicum of skill in the profession. I should be able to hit them from here, but Arash is certainly more skilled than I. But you can do it. I can. Archer agreed. Is that your order to open fire? Ritska looked over to Drake for a few moments before closing his eyes and releasing a sigh. Yeah. Understood. Archer responded. The servant held his hand out and a large black steel bow manifested in his left hand. Blue energy coalesced around his right as he manifested a simple arrow and knocked it into the metal wire and pulled. The bow released a groaning sound as it bent as far back as it could before Archer released it in the direction of the other ship. The projectile shot through the sky with a trail of red light left behind in its wake. A muzzle flash went off in the distance before the arrow was consumed in a small explosion. Archer released a small hum. It appears they have an archer servant of their own. Is it going to be a problem? It is certainly going to be vexing. Archer admitted as he prepared another arrow. But it depends how skilled they are. Ritska made to reply before he heard a clunk of metal behind him. He turned around to see Ash with a bow made of pure steel and taller than he was. The unkindled saber proceeded to knock an arrow larger than his arm, and looking more like a small spear than an arrow, and aim it in the direction of the enemy ship. Ash, Ritska sputtered, I thought. I didn't know you could use a bow. I am unkindled Ritska. Ash replied with a steady voice as he pulled the string back as far as it would go. There are few weapons I cannot use. Before Ritska could make a reply to that claim, he heard an amused chuckle from behind him. Turning around, he saw Boudica watching the exchange with a hint of amusement in her eyes. An archer who uses swords and a saber who uses a bow. She commented before giving an exaggerated roll of her eyes. Should I be expecting a caster who uses a spear next? Ash released the arrow with such force that Ritska felt his hair flutter slightly. The spear, because it couldn't have been anything else, shot across the surface of the water before it seemingly impacted something in the air, and instead of hitting the ship dead on, seemed to veer off course and strike the bow at an angle and glance off the planks and slam into the water. Ash frowned. It would appear the archer is of passing skill. He shot your arrow out of the air, Oscar commented as he rushed past, having caught a glimpse of the attack. I believe that goes beyond passing. True enough, Ash agreed as he knocked another arrow, this one being equally as long but much simpler and in the shape of a traditional arrow. He then paused as he noticed something. They do not appear to be slowing down. Ritska blinked and then looked towards the ship, getting larger by the second so that he could make out most of the details of it at this point, as it continued to approach them without any sign that it was going to slow down. Or change course. Mash's eyes nearly bulged out of her skull. Are they going to ram us? Hard to starboard, Drake shouted out after coming to the same realization. Try and turn into them. We'll unload a broadside. Aye, Captain. The crew leaned heavily as Drake spanned the wheel and caused the ship to abruptly turn. Flashes of red light still continuing to dance through the sky as Archer maintained his salvo upon the enemy servants. At this point only few of his arrows were getting through and they didn't appear to be causing much in the way of damage to the ship. Something's wrong with that ship, Boudica frowned. It might be similar to my chariot. A noble phantasm then? Ash frowned as he took aim with the bow. Most unfortunate then. Broadside, Drake shouted out as the ship continued to turn. Sight the masts and prepare to fire on my command. Ash released another arrow towards the ship. This time the projectile hit home and bounced off the hull without so much as leaving a scratch. Oh, Ash blinked. It seems as though Ryder was correct. So it seems. Boudica frowned. That is quite the mount as well. She pushed Ritska behind her and rested her hand on the pommel of her straight sword. Mash took it as a cue for her to move in front of Ritska as ship closed in on them. Fire all, Drake ordered. The gunners lowered the igniting sticks onto the fuses and covered their ears. The cannons cried out as gunpowder exploded and propelled the steel balls across the surface of the water and directly into the ship. The few that were even close anyway, but once again, failing to do no form of damage. Damn, Drake cursed as she continued to try and turn the ship. They're still closing. Cannons did nothing either. Master, I'm going to try something. Archer's voice came through Ritska's ear. I suggest covering your ears, they'll soon be too close. Go ahead. Ritska encouraged him. Archer took in a deep breath as he held out his right hand. The shape of a coiled sword soon began to take form before he knocked it into the string. Pulling back the arrow, the weapon groaned as the steel elongated into a thinner shape. Archer focused his eyes entirely on the center of the ship towards the base of the mast. I am the bone of my sword. The words of power left his lips easily as the sword began to hum with power, soon degrading into a crackle as fractures appeared in the weapon itself. My core is twisted in madness. He made to release. Khaled, he let out a cry of pain instead as something slammed into his shoulder. His aim abruptly jerked off to the side as he released the arrow in completely the wrong direction. The coiled sword tore through space as it soared far above the ship in question before disappearing into the distance. The archer servant stumbled back, clasping his right limb as the trail of blood soon began to follow. His eyes narrowed at the wound before a fizzle of light dissipated and revealed a simple wooden arrow buried in his shoulder. He grimaced as he jumped from the crow's nest towards the center of the ship. His boots roughly collided with the ground as he rolled to the side. Archer, Mash's worried voice came to his ears, almost making him wanting to crack a sarcastic comment. He was in a bit too much pain for that. What happened? Oscar grabbed his uninjured shoulder and pulled him away whilst raising his shield to cover the pair of them, their enemy bowmen. Uses invisible arrows. Archer cursed his luck as he grabbed the shaft and pulled it free, hissing in pain. No wonder I didn't see it. Quite the trick. Oscar grimly remarked, how wounded. Knew where to shoot me. He sighed, won't be able to stop them all that much now. He stared at his left arm, his fingers twitched slightly, as for how long it will take to heal, not long, but in our situation. 'Tis far too long. Oscar surmised, worry not, the fault of this does not lie with you. The saber assured him as he rested the servant down, we will make do. Archer grunted, I'm not an invalid. I can still fight. He tried to roll his shoulder and cringed. Not as well as I used to though. Brace for impact. Drake called out as she tried to turn the ship so that it would just graze the bow of the enemy vessel. Unfortunately it turned into her. The strut on the bow of the ship aimed straight at the center of their ship. Senpai! Mash exclaimed as she grabbed Ritsuka and rushed away from the point of impact, quickly. Ash dissipated his bow and made for safety as well, his hand going for the sword on his back. The vessel slammed into the Golden Hind. The bow punctured through the side of the ship and caused the entire vessel to abruptly jerk to a halt with several crew members almost falling over in response. Great, Euryale grumbled to herself. Asterios held onto her side to keep her from falling over as he hunched himself over to keep himself stable. It's him. Ritsuka turned to face her with a look of confusion. You mean it's? Yes, she sighed, he's the man who's been after me. Her lips curled downwards into a look of pure disgust. They're also the world's most perverted servant. Ritsuka wasn't entirely sure how he was supposed to respond to that. Heavy footfalls along the deck of the opposing ship heralded the approach of a man, taller by a head than anyone else on the ship and almost towards the same height as Havel. The figure crested the top of the ship and stared down onto the crew of the Golden Hind. Ritsuka felt his body tense as the man's eyes scanned the entire complement, the man's form being fully visible to all at this point as he stared down at them. Wearing a long black coat with his bare chest exposed. A long silver-hooked claw extending over his right hand with golden bracelets around both of his wrists. His hair was messy with a furry beard extending down from his face. The man continued to stare at them with a blank expression before his eyes fell onto one individual in particular. They then gleamed with interest as Euryale felt a disturbed shiver creep up her spine. A hook for a hand, Roman muttered as he stared at the screen. Pirate ship. Wait, he widened his eyes, it couldn't be. What is it, Doctor? Mash asked, preparing herself as the other servants all readied their weapons in preparation for a fight. That servant's identity. Man, it's so cliché but I can't think of anyone else who would match the description. The doctor frowned. If I'm correct. That man is probably the origin for the image brought forth when discussing the concept of pirates, better known around the world as Blackbeard. But his real name is Edward Teach. Oh wow, Ritsuka widened his eyes. That's something. I know. Romani grimaced, be careful Fujimaru-kun. You're dealing with a pirate on their own territory. These readings as well. They're beyond a normal servant. I can see. Olga bit her thumb. He must be the holder of the Holy Grail we're after. At least our search has ended. David helpfully supplied. Not now you airhead, Romani snapped, this is terrible. Blackbeard slowly uncrossed his arms as he stared at Euryale, his lips drawing themselves into a thin line before they slowly parted. Euryale-chan, he exclaimed in a high-pitched voice, his expression doing a complete 180 until it was in a gleeful leer, you're really here. Ah, he cooed, so cute. It's way too cute, I want to lick you up and be licked. He threw his arms wide, mainly around the armpits because they're just so soft. His eyes then widened as an epiphany came to him. Oh, please step on my barefooted as well. I want to be walked all over like a little cockroach. His words of wisdom, seemingly gifted. Dead silence spread across the deck of the ship. Ritsuka found himself blinking several times before he moved his hand up to his ear and cleaned it out with his finger as he tried to ensure he didn't have anything stuck in it. Boudica's face was scrunched up in a way where she wasn't entirely sure how she was supposed to react to whatever that was. Her shoulders had gone slack with her brows furrowed. At this point, Havel surmised the situation best. What the fuck? And mimics and Blackbeard. Pretty long chapter as well, and Archer got snipped before he could use boom sword by someone. Who was it? All will be revealed in the next chapter. In the meantime, away, water down, hoe down. Ash blinked several times, staring at the now named Edward Teach with furrowed brows before he slowly looked over to Euryale, the goddess still fidgeting uncomfortably, until Asterios stepped in the way of the goddess, blocking her off from sight with a menacing growl on his face. Blackbeard's giddy expression soon vanished, replaced by an annoyed scowl. Hey, hey. He made a shooing motion at the berserker. Get out of the way, you're blocking my sight of Euryale-chan. Euryale-chan. Ash whispered to himself under his breath, still at a loss for words as to what was going on. If the expressions of the other members of the crew were any indication, he wasn't the only one. Move, move. Blackbeard clicked his tongue. Damn, I wanna stare at Euryale-chan's petite figure that looks as though it's made from the most delicate glass. His voice left him in a frustrated whine at this point. I wanna sear it into my brain before I can actually get a hold of her and gently rub the skin between my fingers like dough. He waved his hand. Come on, don't deny me this, man. You got bigger problems, ass, Drake shouted at him. You've been harassing me for days now. But you're in deep shit this time, I'm gonna make sure you. Huh? Blackbeard's expression did a complete 180. The man staring towards Drake with a perfect mask. Sorry, I didn't see you there. I have this thing where my eyes and ears filter out old hags. His expression morphed into a grimace. I mean, what's with the way you dress too? Exposing those useless breasts. He shrugged. I mean, yeah, they're big, but that's really all you've got going for you. He paused before he cupped his chin, squinting his eyes to get a better look at Drake and giving a thoughtful hum. I guess the scar's alright. He admitted. But that's really it. Your age is the real problem. Blackbeard widened his eyes and snapped his fingers. That it? He grinned. You're like one of those ship captains who get these stupidly large boats to cover up their own insecurities. The extended finger pointed towards her chest. Exposing all those while you're some hag is really kinda embarrassing to see if I'm being honest. A frown made its way onto his face. I guess if you were half your current age you'd be alright, but... Well, he gave a lopsided shrug. You're just past your prime. Like a fruit that's been left out too long. His expression turned dreamy. If Euryale-chan is the finest grape to ever bless this man's vision, you're like some raisin I found down the back of a chair. David stared up at the captain, wincing as he saw her expression and then looked back to Blackbeard. Sorry. He called out to the man. Looks like she stopped thinking about halfway through your speech. Really? Blackbeard let out a HRMPH sound. Suppose that's kinda typical for the elderly. Huh. Mash jolted as she came out of her trance, her expression warped into one of shock. Senpai, she whispered to Ritsuka, what is that? Ritsuka was still staring at Blackbeard with his mouth slightly agape before it snapped shut. I think that's Blackbeard? No, Mash replied in a dead voice. I refuse to believe it. I cannot accept that he is also a servant. I will not. Their exchange, however, did not go entirely unnoticed. Blackbeard's eyes snapped towards the hushed voices with a particular fervency to them and fixed themselves entirely upon Mash. The man's expression was still blank as he scanned her up and down. Eek! Mash recoiled at the sudden pressure she felt, holding her shield out in front of her. Blackbeard's left hand moved to cradle his chin. The man soon gave subtle nod of his head before grinning. Yes. I approve of you. He spoke with such fervor that had Mash dread what exactly he approved of. He held both his hands out and formed a square with his fingers, focusing entirely on the shielder. That nervous energy contradicted by that confident stature, that one visible eye which shines with perfect innocence and that marble-like skin. He grinned at Mash, gifting her a thumbs up. Yes. I 100% approve. Senpai. Mash recoiled away from the man, actually hiding behind the master with a horrified look on his face. I'm scared. Oh, Blackbeard titled his head? A senpai-kohai relationship as well? His eyes gleamed. Yes. A close second to Euryale-chan, not bad girl. She's a little young. Boudica gave Blackbeard a disapproving scowl as she stepped towards the shielder to obscure her from view. In much the same way Asterios had done to Euryale. Unfortunately it brought her in Blackbeard's crosshairs. Whoa! Blackbeard let out a surprised shout as he gaped at Boudica. This power. This is, he rested his hand over his hurt and grinned. This is Big Oni-san energy. That girl, she radiates pure energy, as if she were born for the role. Boudica paused, staring at Blackbeard with wide eyes. What do you? She's even got massive boobs that don't feel tacked on, he exclaimed, throwing his hands up in victory. The promised land indeed. She'd ensnare a younger brother figure and pull them into the valley of no return. I can almost feel the warmth coursing through my body. Boudica's expression had become one of horror. A quiet snickering brought her burning gaze onto Archer, his face instantly reverting to a more composed one as he still sat cradling his injured shoulder. I'm getting distracted with all these beauties, Blackbeard cursed, slapping himself on the forehead. I'm here for Uriah-Chan first and foremost. His eyes fell onto Ritsuka and his expression turned blank. You're the master here, right? Huh? Ritsuka blinked then nodded his head. Yeah. Good. Blackbeard grunted. Makes things easier. Hand over Uriah or I'll gut you and throw your body to the sharks. The tone in which he delivered the rather brutal threat was one without a hint of emotion within it, as if the affair would be nothing more than a chore for him. Why do you want the goddess anyway? Ash inquired, pulling his greatsword free from the scabbard on his back. What value is she to you? You ain't blind, are you? Blackbeard gave Ash a funny look. Just fix your eyes upon her. Ain't you ever seen something more beautiful in your life? Ash slowly looked away from Blackbeard and stared at Uriah. The goddess gave him a raised eyebrow at his blank expression before the unkindled turned away and back to the pirate. She doesn't look hideous, but I see no reason to pursue her. That's the entire point of my purpose, Uriah indignantly growled. What is wrong with you? Does she have some hidden ability? Ash tried to question. Something in her possession you require? Her body. Blackbeard answered immediately. You want her body? Ash blinked. I made it pretty obvious. Blackbeard looked at Ash as if he were an idiot. I want her body to touch and hold and be held. Is that it? Ash frowned. Just. He looked away for a few moments and then back to the man. It does not seem to be something worth killing over. Are you all right? Blackbeard asked with a tone of genuine sincerity, worry present on his face. Does your brain work? He pointed towards the goddess. Uriah-Chan. Object of living beauty is right there and you don't feel anything? Well, Ash frowned. Am I supposed to? Yikes. Blackbeard cringed. I'm tempted just to kill you now and call it mercy. You may do as you wish with the others. A suave voice called out from behind the pirate as a man made his way past. Ash's eyes fixed themselves onto the new arrival and his expression turned cold. But this unkindled. He is mine. Oh, Blackbeard raised an eyebrow. Personal business. Always nasty I guess. The new arrival was dressed in a loose-fitting white silken shirt, a leather girdle belt around his waist and short white-colored trousers which extended just below his knee with no footwear to speak of. The man's handsome features were marred with a heavy frown as he stared at Ash. Ash, for his part, still stared up at the man without changing his expression in the least. You waste words bantering with this fiend, Capitan. He paced towards the edge of the ship and placed his hands on the railing. This butcher knows nothing of beauty and lives only to kill. I was not expecting a spear of Philionor to be here. Ash replied with a toneless voice, or in such curious company. Indeed. The man scowled. I would still be in service to the princess if you had not disregarded the orders of King Gwyn and defiled the city. Ash frowned but said nothing. The man frowned at him. Have you no words? Have you neither the shame nor the courage to admit to your acts? I was charged with aiding Gale in retrieving the Dark Soul. Ash calmly replied. Everything else was not of consequence. And Shira? She should not have challenged me. Ash frowned. I would have been content to leave her be if she had given me the same courtesy. She was charged with protecting the princess you killed. I did not kill Philionor. Havel's head snapped towards Ash so fast it almost blurred, the berserker's form stilled. You did. The man growled. The Grail provides me with much knowledge now. You awoke the princess from her slumber and brought ruin to the city. It is now all lost to time and even the immortal lords are dead because of you. He narrowed his eyes. Was what you sought worth all that murder? Yes. Ash replied back without even waiting. I succeeded in retrieving the pigment. Therefore anything else did not matter. He frowned. Are you here for vengeance? No, the man shook his head. Before I mete out justice to you, I shall hear your commiserations for your acts of barbarity. He narrowed his eyes, his hand moving down to the sword on his waist. slowly unsheathing it and revealing the black katana. Ash stared at him in silence for a few moments before he replied, "You will be disappointed in my answer then." "I see." The man sighed, closing his eyes before they opened again. "In that case, I, Halflight, Spear of Filianor, shall deliver you justice." That's real great. Blackbeard sniffed. "So, as for Euryale. Cannons." Drake's dull voice cut them off, her eyes burning with life. "I don't care how close we are. I don't care about if you can or can't. I want every cannon we have to fire on that man." "Someone's mad." Blackbeard snickered. "Guess it's easier doing it this way as well." The pirate exclaimed, "Let's get Euryale-chan." He paused and then shrugged, "Also the Grail while we're at it." "Not while we're at it." Another figure walked past Blackbeard, this one wearing a long red coat with bleached blonde hair and ruby-colored eyes, twirling a long rifle in her arms before resting it on her shoulder. "That Grail is what we're here for." She paused for a few moments before continuing on. "Also please don't come any closer." He. Blackbeard snickered before moving his fingers to his mouth and blowing an ear-piercing whistle. "Hey Sammy, you're up." Drake blinked. "Sam." Space in front of her distorted as a black sphere came into being mere feet from her. The woman recoiled as the burning circle dissipated and left a figure behind. Drake's eyes went wide as she went for her pistol. What the she? A muscled blue arm lashed out and clamped down around her wrist before she could move. The woman cringed and lashed out with a kick towards them. The figure swung her to the side and sent her crashing into the railings. Drake let out a pained grunt as they raised her up and again and slammed her into the deck of the ship. "Captain Drake, you should watch where you look, young lady." Mash skidded to a halt and raised her shield just in time to block a sword aimed at her neck. The curved blade extended around the shield and cut into her cheek, causing her to let out a small gasp of pain and jump back. Clad in bronze-colored armor, not a single aspect of skin was showing on the servant in front of her. The armor was more decorative than anything else, with the ornamental shape of two arms emboldened on the front as if the man was receiving a hug from something. Flat-top prongs of metal extended up from his full-covered helmet and on each of his shoulder pauldrons. In each hand he held a shottle sword, the leftmost one stained with a small drizzle of blood from where he had cut her. "A battle is no place to be careless, you know." His tone was light and almost caring, yet Mash refused to allow herself to be fooled by it. His sudden attack and the complete lack of a presence until moments ago had all but revealed his class to them. "Such horrible things can occur, ha ha ha." "Mash," Ritsuka called out in surprise before the shielder tensed herself. "Stay back, senpai. He's an assassin," she exclaimed as she prepared her shield. "Oh, such an ugly word." The man tutted, spinning the swords in his hand. "I prefer the term, survivor. It is as you said, I did bring ruin to the ringed city." Ash parried away the blackened katana with ease as he thrust the aquamarine dagger towards Halflight's head. The man ducked low and thrust his free arm forwards across the deck. The surface crackled with yellow lighting. Ash rolled to the side as golden spears burst from the orbs scattered across the ground in a trail moving across the length of the ship. It did not take much effort to discern that waking the princess from her slumber would destroy what had been crafted. Halflight rushed towards the unkindled with his blade prepared to be slashed upwards. The man swung the weapon towards Ash's chest. The unkindled swung his own greatsword down with one hand to meet the blow. The two men buckled against each other's strength before Ash bodily slammed his shoulder into the man's chest. Halflight let out a dry wheeze as the air was forced from his lungs. Raising the sword high across his body, Ash swung downwards towards the man's head. Halflight leaned away from the blow, the edge of Stormruler just passing scant but a few inches above the man's head before the unkindled reversed the dagger in his left hand and raised it up high to thrust downwards. The air above Halflight glowed as the summoned spear tips burned themselves into existence and rocketed towards his body. Ash grunted and rolled backwards, the summons shooting off into the air and avoiding him entirely before he returned to his feet. Ducking his head to the side as he felt something nip his cheek and narrowing his eyes at the man, Halflight had sheathed his sword and drawn his bow, the weapon made of intertwined white birch wood, and was already preparing another arrow. Stormruler exploded to life with the power of the wind. The saber swung the weapon upwards and sent a powerful gust of wind towards the enemy servant. Halflight staggered as the wind struck him, sending his aim wildly of course as the unkindled rushed to exploit the opening. Sheathing the dagger, he lashed out with his left hand around Halflight's wrist as he attempted to draw his sword again. Having said that, I will not claim to have felt any joy from the action. Then swung his body around so as to smash his elbow into the man's jaw. Halflight staggered with the blow but didn't get far as Ash's grip was still tight around his limb. Then rearing his head back, Ash jerked the man forwards and slammed his forehead into Halflight's nose in an explosion of blood. Nor did I feel any shame either. Ash stared down at the dazed man with a frown. It was simply an act which I believed needed doing. Something which would have brought meaning to that meaningless place. Finally releasing the man, Ash slammed his leg into Halflight's chest and sent the man rolling across the wooden deck. If you believe that the notion of cruelty entered my mind as I woke the princess, then you have overestimated me. He advanced on the man, staring down at him with a frown. The truth is that the consequences of the act meant nothing to me. Halflight made to rise again, only for Ash to kick him in the side of the head. You had your duty to protect her and I had mine to retrieve the dark soul. He clasped his free hand around the grip of Stormruler and raised it above his head. As one of duty you should understand what should be devoted to seeing its completion. Ha! Ha ha! Ha ha ha! Ash paused as Halflight barked out a broken laugh. Do not compare my duty to yours. Unkindled. I took on mine of my own volition. He looked up at Ash through a bloodied sneer. It brought me pride to serve the princess. I performed my duty out of purpose. Ash stared down at him. That is why you failed. No, it is why you shall remain a slave. Halflight lashed out. The ground beneath Ash's left foot glowed before a spear shot through his boot. Ash let out a grunt of pain as the spear disappeared and revealed a bloodied hole in his boot, the saber made to finish the man. Arg! He recoiled as something collided with his right shoulder and had him step backwards, the limb falling limply at his side. His eyes snapped away from Halflight and quickly found the blonde-haired girl from earlier with the long wooden crossbow of some variety still aimed towards him. Ash frowned and pulled his left arm back. Goo! He coughed out blood when Halflight thrust the frayed blade through his gut to the hilt. Ash responded quickly and slammed his open left palm onto the man's chest at the exposed skin. The widening of Halflight's eyes meant the man understood the implication, and even if he hadn't, it was impossible to ignore the sudden buildup of heat before Ash's palm exploded with a brilliant orange flame, sending the man blasting away from him and roughly onto the ground. A gruesome burn mark now present on his body in the center of his chest. Ash rolled forwards as something collided with the wood where he had been. The shattering noise of the planks filled his ears as he shot back to his feet and flung his arm towards the woman, releasing a titanic fireball with smaller orbs of flame circling around it. The woman widened her eyes and jumped from her position on the bow of the ship, roughly landing onto the deck of the Golden Hind and spinning around to level her gun towards the unkindled before she stopped. His instincts kicked in as he jumped to the side and barely avoided a curved red blade from bisecting him, wielded by a small white-haired girl in an oversized black coat which hid away her lower face. She span on her heel and thrust towards his chest. Ash's left hand clamped down around the handle of the dagger on his belt and swung it upwards. The blade of the aquamarine dagger burst to life with blue crystal and extended into a short sword. The pale crystalline structure collided with the cutlass and stopped the blow. The girl paused and looked up at Ash's cold expression with barely a hint of surprise before she rolled away from him. Ash ducked down as something whisked overhead, accompanied by the crack of thunder. Boudica stumbled backwards as the man continued his assault. Despite his attention being split between herself and Mash, he didn't seem to be losing much in the way of ground. Taking their attacks in stride, she winced as the hooked sword curved around her own blade and bit into her shoulder. Raising her shield, she pushed the blade away from herself and thrust towards his chest. The man reversed his left sword and blocked the strike with the inner curve of the blade while taking only a single step back. The helmet tilted slightly as Mash rushed in at his side. The man suddenly leapt into the air, turning his body and planting a two-footed kick onto the center of Mash's shield and using it to propel himself away from the duo, spinning through the air while he did so, and landing on his feet a good few meters away from them. This need not be so challenging for you. He spoke with a hint of aggression in his voice. We need only the girl, and surely she has no value to you. I don't trade in people. Boudica scowled at him as she tensed herself, or trust the word of men like you. Tut, tut, he sighed, shaking his head. Well then, if it is a fight you are after, have it you. He rushed down low, shuttles extending from either side of his body like a pair of wings before he kicked off the ground and twirled through the air. Boudica blocked the tip of the right blade aimed at her face as the man landed while he swung the left down towards Mash's legs. The girl slammed her shield into the inner groove of the sword and knocked it away from herself. The assassin clicked his tongue, helmet shifting between Boudica and Mash before a heavy crash across the ship had everyone stumble slightly. Boudica jerked forwards and briefly lost her footing. Assassin exploded into action, leaping towards the rider and swinging the shuttle towards her side. Mash rushed towards him before he swung his right shuttle down towards her. The girl raised the shield to block the impact, the groove of the blade falling perfectly over the rim of the shield. Assassin jerked the blade forward so the hook swung down and stabbed into the back of Mash's shoulder. The girl let out a pained shout as Assassin pulled the blade clean and swept his leg down towards the base of the shield. His heel impacted against it and, with her still distracted from the wound, pushed the shield to the side. He danced backwards when Boudica launched forth a dozen rays of golden light towards him, the man hopping away from her as he avoided the beams. Boudica's eyes briefly darted away from the assassin and towards the crash. The woman almost gave a groan of annoyance when she saw who was responsible. Havel still in a duel with the enemy berserker, because of course they would have gone for each other. The other man being Ginger with what looked like shaven horns on either side of his head, an exposed chest and dark baggy trousers with thick leather boots and wielding an axe that looked as though it was made from molten lava. The enemy berserker stumbled backwards as Havel slammed his club into the man's guard. The stone-armored berserker towered over his opponent and was merciless with his advance against him. Havel raised the club over his shoulder again and swung downwards. The berserker jumped back as the club slammed into the deck of the ship and cracked the floorboards inwards before he ripped it free of the ground. His opponent charged forwards with a savage cry, swinging the axe towards Havel's side. The bishop grunted as he twisted his body so as to take it on the shield mounted on his back. The axe slammed into him and caused him to steady himself from the impact before he responded in kind. The powerful backhand he unleashed against the opposite number sent the Ginger berserker helicoptering through the air before smashing into the railings of the ship and shattering them, sending fragments into the murky depths. Havel let out a grunt as he advanced on the downed opponent. Releasing a roar, the berserker abruptly jumped into life, swinging their axe in a backhanded motion aimed towards Havel's head. The taller berserker, with little time to do much else, raised their left forearm in a blocking motion. The edge of the axe struck his guard and caused him to stagger at the surprising level of power behind the blow as the axe chipped away at his stone armor. Havel let loose a menacing growl of his own as he swung Dragon Tooth into the ribs of the opposing berserker. The ginger man's eyes went wide with pain as a bloodied cough erupted from his mouth as the strike carried him off his feet and onto his side. Marching towards the man, Dragon's Tooth casting a menacing shadow over the berserker's head as Havel prepared to deliver the final strike against them. The berserker rolled away as Havel slammed the club into the deck of the ship. The entire boat violently rocked on its side as a result of the impact, Havel stumbling forwards with the force of the impact as well as the other servants current on board the ship. The ginger man leapt to his feet and span on his heel, raising his arm high and delivering a savage haymaker into Havel's left side of his helmet. The berserker's head snapped to the side from the blow before they responded in kind, releasing their grip on the club and swinging his fist upwards into the berserker's ribs. The crunching sound of bone echoed out as the punch lifted the man off his feet. Havel followed through with the attack and swung his left arm towards the man's jaw. The berserker raised their arms to block the strike and only marginally succeeded. The punch slammed into his guard and forced him onto one knee. Havel's right arm was thrown in a quick jab which collided with the berserker's nose and sent them reeling. Raising his hands above his head, Havel clasped them together and swung them down like a hammer, smashing them into the berserker's shoulder, and was rewarded by a violent popping sound as the limb was violently, and painfully if the scream was any indication, thrown out of place. As the berserker screamed, Havel lashed out with his hands and clasped them onto either side of the man's head before raising him into the air. The berserker thrashed and kicked with his legs against Havel's armor, not doing much to break the bishop's grip on him. Havel then started to squeeze. The berserker began to thrash harder as Havel continued to crush his skull, blood soon starting to leak from his nose as he now attempted to punch the bishop. Havel grunted as the blows landed but didn't let go, instead opting to strengthen his grip on the man. The final cries of pain of the berserker were soon silenced, the echoes overwhelmed by a sickening splatter as Havel crushed the man's skull, decorating his hands and the front of his helmet with blood and fragments of head as the headless body fell back to the ground, soon flickering away into motes of light. Letting of a dismissive scoff, Havel turned away from the body and saw Asterios and Euryale staring at him, the latter with a mildly disturbed expression on her face. Havel scoffed, looking away from her and retrieving his club from off the ground before looking around to find a new target. The enemy berserker's spirit origin has faded. Ritska barely heard Romani in his ear as he focused his attention solely on Mash, although there's still the other servants to worry about, and that, his voice trailed off, Fujimaru-kun, that figure, they radiate pure divinity on the level of a divine spirit. Ritska knew who Romani meant, he'd known the moment they'd literally blinked into existence. It wasn't something he had ever expected to see, although right now he couldn't focus on that, not with the chaos happening around him. Mash. Ritska turned his attention to the shielder as the bronze-armored man continued his assault. The master held out his hand. I'm gonna use a mystic code. Be ready, Mash. Yes, senpai. Mash replied as the assassin struck his swords against her shield again. Boudica rushed in at his side and locked blades with the man, the assassin taking a single step backwards before he twisted the shuttle in his wrist, wrapping the curved blade around Boudica's straight sword and yanking it to the side, throwing her swing wide before spinning around and nailing her in the gut with a high kick. Boudica grunted as she took a single step back in response. She caught Mash give her a quick nod and prepared herself for movement. Mash rushed towards the assassin, swinging her shield wide and towards his head. The assassin ducked low so as to avoid it. Emergency evasion. Ritska's mystic code lit up as the shielder vanished in a burst of light, reappearing closer to the assassin and slightly above him. The assassin barely managed to get out a surprised gasp before Mash slammed her shield into the back of his head, sending him stumbling forwards and into a Boudica's kick, the rider flipping backwards as she did so. The assassin let out a grunt as he was launched backwards. Mash swung her shield in a clockwise motion and battered it into his gut with enough force to blast the assassin away from her and onto his back. Ritska spared the assassin a glance before he directed his attention to other points of conflict towards the ship, barely hearing a crash before he heard a pained shout from where Drake had been. Oscar released a grunt as his back slammed into the deck, quickly rolling aside as a spear of pale light slammed into the spot where he had been and blasted through the wooden planks with very little effort. The knight released a grunt as he returned to his feet and raised his shield in a blocking motion as he paced around the target. White wings spread themselves wide. Blue highlights colored the tips of the feathers. Two arms were folded across the figure's chest in a dismissive way while the other two were held up and continually throwing spells towards himself and Drake. A hood covered the creature's head, preventing them from seeing any form of expression on their attacker's face. Oscar had never even heard of something like this before, let alone how he could fight it. This is awkward. David rushed past him with his staff. The hooded figure snapped their attention towards him and raised their upper arm with their palm outstretched. A spear of light shot forth from the limb towards the archer. The man made no attempt to block as it struck some form of barrier in front of him and dissipated into nothing. The angel lowered his hand and stared at the archer who, for his part, gave a shrug in response. It's magic resistance, the Lord has seen fit to bless me. He replied before looking the angel up and down, and although you have divinity about you, something tells me you aren't one of his. He hummed, twirling his staff, oh well, and rushed forwards. The angel swung its left wing down to cover its body as Drake attempted to unload into it. The steel balls struck the defense and left scuff marks on the wings before the angel revealed itself again and thrust its palm towards Drake. The air in front of it began to glow as a ball of fire came into existence and shot across the deck towards the woman. Drake cursed and rolled away as the attack just narrowly flew over her head. The angel swung downwards with its upper right arm. Light exploded from its hand and condensed into the shape of a sword before striking David's staff. The man buckled slightly under the power of the blow and stared up at the angel with a slightly strained smile. The arms across its chest unfolded themselves. The angel raised its sword arm and swung its body towards David, striking him in the chest with a quick jab. David coughed out and retaliated by spinning the staff in his hands and striking the angel in the side of the head with the top of the weapon. The servant didn't so much as make a sound from being hit. Oscar charged towards it, shield raised, and sword in preparation for a thrusting motion. With a beat of its wings, the angel shot backwards as space tore open behind it, revealing a black circular gate with a burning white ring around it before the gate collapsed. Oscar slid to a halt and allowed his eyes to go wide. David similarly looked stunned before his eyes widened at something behind Oscar. The knight span on his heel just as the form of the angel rematerialized through the gate. The servant clasped its lower arms together and thrust them forwards. A pure beam of light erupted from its palms and shot towards Oscar. The knight had just enough time to raise his shield before the attack slammed into him with enough force to blast the servant off his feet and send him cartwheeling through the air and face first onto the deck below. A gunshot echoed out before a bullet slammed into the angel's forearm. The being recoiled as the steel ball punctured a hole through the pale blue skin and revealed black blood. The being stared at the wound before craning its hooded head over to Drake, the woman giving it a triumphant smirk. Never expected to see someone's guardian angel. She blew air through her mouth. Never would have expected to kill one either, but life's funny like that. She cringed. Hope mine doesn't get angry over this. If it's any consolation to you, I don't think it's one of his angels. David offered. They tend to be less involved than people think they are. So just looks like one. She frowned. Pretty poor taste there. She shrugged. Maybe I'll get some goodwill. Wasn't there something against false idols? Ha ha ha. David chuckled as the being's head looked between the two of them. Indeed there is. The angel raised its upper left arm above his head, its thumb and middle finger pressed tightly together before it snapped them. A black circle opened up above its head with a burning orange ring around it. That don't look good, Drake muttered out as she took aim at the angel. A ball of fire shot out of the burning ring and towards her at incredible speeds. The woman let out a surprised gasp as she jumped over the barrier and onto the main deck below as the fireball crashed into the floor, leaving a scorch mark along the ground. The angel, still floating above the ground, turned its body around to face David without making a single sound. The archer chuckled as he prepared his staff. All right then. This looks troublesome. Blackbeard scratched his chin as he watched the fight play out below him on the deck of the Golden Hind. The man's eyes scanned the chaos unfurling as the servants battled before wincing at the death of the berserker. Oh, well, I guess Eric died. He spoke without much emotion as the stone-armored man dropped the corpse and moved across the deck. No biggie though, he was technically one of the weakest we had. He smelled really bad too. Blackbeard grimaced. Way too macho for my tastes, although he felt less likely to kill me than the other guy. Quaint. The dry voice echoed out behind him as heavy footsteps signaled the arrival of the final member of his crew. The man dressed in thick plates of dark iron armor with a long flowing crimson cape bolted onto his back. The dark-haired man with a single scar trailing down from his forehead to his chin diagonally from left to right and a small burn mark on his right cheek fixed his hazel eyes onto Blackbeard. Although that is why I told you not to allow them to rush off like fools. Yeah, Blackbeard grumbled. Technically it was the guy in the shirt. Halfwit. The man clicked his tongue, eyes darting around before falling on the goddess and Asterios. Only the beast to guard her? Yeah. Go get her, savvy? That was my intention. He strode past Blackbeard, hand falling onto the pommel of his sword before he vaulted over the railings of the ship and landed roughly onto the deck of the ship. Rising back to his 6'2" height and fixing his eyes entirely upon the Minotaur and the goddess. Asterios' head snapped in his direction as if sensing the hostility. The armored man started impassively at the beast before he began to stride across the deck without a hint of apprehension, ripping his longsword free from its scabbard and closing in on the Minotaur. Releasing a growl, the berserker spread its two halberds wide in preparation for the attack. The man stopped a few feet from the bullman, looking him up and down with a perfect mask of an expression before his lip curled slightly, like a stunted Taurus demon. He commented before assuming his stance, but very well. Won't let you harm her. Asterios growled out, taking a single step forwards. The man raised a single eyebrow at the berserker before shrugging. A loyal pet then, he dismissed, tensing his body and shifting his stance so as to prepare himself. The man continued to scan the berserker up and down, It wasn't any discernible technique that he could see, but he imagined a beast of that size likely had some great strength behind it. He took a single step backwards as a white short sword cleaved through the air in front of his face. Hazel eyes followed the blade towards a tanned man wearing a red shroud with steel-gray eyes locked onto him. The pair stared at each other with matching blank expressions before he exploded into motion. His left arm blurred and slapped the tanned man's sword arm. The weapon in his grip shot upwards before he turned his body and thrust towards the man's chest. The servant smirked before his left hand flashed to life, parrying away at the straight sword with a black blade which seemed to materialize from nowhere. RRRGH. The red-caped man snapped his head to the side at the roar, the Minotaur charging towards him with his halberd thrust towards his midsection like a spear. The armored man clicked his tongue, slamming his heel in Archer and shooting away from the berserker's attack, ducking low so the halberd went over his head and closing the distance with Astario's chest. The berserker grunted and stabbed its second halberd into the floor in front of him as the man slashed at his ribs. The straight sword collided with the pole with a heavy clang before recoiling. The man pursed his lips as he jumped away just before Archer could bifurcate him with the twin swords. Ritska lowered his arm away from Archer. Didn't know these were so handy, he muttered to himself. First aid is a pretty powerful mystic spell, Romani admitted, but you can't use it that often, it'll drain you pretty quick, so best to command your servants well. Right. Ritska nodded his head, scanning the enemy servant. Looks like a saber, so he activated the mental link. Archer, the enemy servant looks like a saber. That is most likely his class, Archer replied as he went on the offensive, the twin swords dancing through the air as he continued to work over the enemy saber. The tanned servant hadn't been able to read much from the sword. It wasn't actually the noble phantasm, in fact its history was little more than a straight sword. He didn't recognize the name of the servant either, which would make them one of very little renown or someone from the alternate world. It would depend if any of the other servants had ever heard of the name, Rendell, before. Think you can keep him distracted or off balance so that Asterios can get him? I will try. Archer thrust Kancho towards the man, the saber. Rendell parried the blow away with his straight sword before he stepped back as Asterios buried the axe head of his weapon into the wooden deck where he had been stood. Archer clicked his tongue, the servant was clearly talented with the sword to some degree. Rendell's eyes flickered between Archer and Asterios, the man's expression never changing before he seemed to tense up. His other hand fell onto his sword's grip and then his presence seemingly grew more intense. His eyes darting towards Archer was the only warning the servant got before Rendell rushed him in a sudden burst of speed. Archer raised the married blades in a crossguard to block the downward slash. The saber struck him with enough strength to bring him to his knees in an instant before twisting the blade in his hands and thrusting the length of the sword upwards and catching the elongated gold-colored hilt underneath the blades and pushing them upwards. Rendell broke through Archer's guard. The servant widened his eyes in alarm before he coughed out a mouthful of air as the man slammed his knee into Archer's gut and blasted him away before spinning around to face Asterios. The raised his sword as the berserker's halberd struck his guard, forcing him to brace himself more than necessary but not quite being barreled over by the strength. Asterios swung the second halberd towards Rendell from the opposite side towards his knee. The saber twisted his body, raising his left leg high and swinging it down in an axe kick as the halberd approached. His heel collided with the flat of the weapon and sent it downwards and stabbing into the wooden planks. Rendell pushed the halberd he was still blocking above his head and charged towards the berserker. He swung his sword at a wide angle, carving a thin bloody line through Asterios' ribs and causing the berserker to let out a growl of pain as he stepped backwards. Rendell reversed his grip on his sword and stabbed downwards, puncturing through the top of Asterios' foot and causing the berserker to let out another grunt of pain before he pulled the blade clean and flicked the blood free from it. Flipping his grip around, he held the sword flat so the point was facing the berserker before unleashing a barrage of rapid thrusts towards the joints in Asterios' arms and legs. Asterios took a single step back and raised both his arms to cover his face as Rendell continued his assault. Puncture marks rapidly began to appear in his forearms and towards the base of his elbow. The berserker took in a lungful of air before their muscles tensed. Rendell recognized the signs and halted his assault before taking a single step back. Letting loose an ear-splitting roar, Asterios swung both his halberds outwards towards the knight, The man raised the flat of his sword to block the sweeping attack and was sent skating backwards across the deck by the force the servant had thrown against him. Rendell grit his teeth as he slowed down, lowering his sword to fix his incensed gaze upon the Minotaur. Asterios was breathing heavily as thin trails of blood ran down his arms as a result of the numerous red holes he now had in each of them. Halflight's head was slammed into the railings. Ash pulled the man's head back by his hair before punting the girl in the gray coat away with a heavy kick to her chest. The girl released a bloodied cough from the attack as she nearly went overboard. The blonde-haired girl seemingly materialized and grabbed her hand, pulling his down and hurling her towards Ash. The girl spanned the rifle around in her hand and fired a shot towards Ash's arm holding Halflight. Ash released the bloodied man as the bullet skimmed just past his elbow before raising the aquamarine dagger again. The crystal blade extended and collided with the red cutlass as the smaller girl struck against Ash's guard. The unkindled stared into her eyes before pushing her away. The girl jumped back until she landed next to her partner. The pair stared at Ash with hyper-focused expressions. The unkindled matched their expressions as his right hand fell onto the pommel of Stormruler and pulled the blade from its spot buried in the wooden flooring before resting it onto his shoulder. His eyes darted back towards Halflight as he upholstered the talisman from his waist and crouched down. Ash swept Stormruler across from in front of him, unleashing a buffeting gale attack towards the man. Halflight looked up at the howling sound just in time for the attack to slam into him and send him back flipping through the air. The two girls in front of him seized the opportunity and rushed towards him. Ash prepared the two weapons in his hand as they charged. He narrowed his eyes. No, it was only the smaller one with the sword that charged him. The second was content to aim her weapon at him. He released a burst of wind from Stormruler which surrounded him in a small twister, before he charged forwards. He swung the great sword towards the smaller girl's head whilst sheathing his knife and darting his hand to his bottomless box. Stormruler collided with the red cutlass and forced it downwards. The woman raised her rifle to take aim and was soon forced to roll aside when Ash quickly hurled a kukuri at her. Sweeping his leg around, he slammed his armored shin into the smaller girl's side and lifted her off into the air before continuing his charge towards the ranged servant. The blonde-haired girl returned to her feet just in time to see Ash looming over her with an intense look in his eyes and large sword cleaving through the air towards her head. Ash grunted and stumbled to the left as something stabbed itself into his ribs. The blonde girl dodged out of the way of the falling blade and avoided Stormruler, and it slashed through the wooded railings and buried itself into the deck. Ash turned to the direction of the stab and his head snapped to the side as his right cheek exploded and his mouth went slightly ajar. The arrow punctured into his ribs became visible at the same time. The one which had buried itself into his face did so as well. Clamping his jaw down, Ash snapped the shaft of the arrow and spat out the font as the back fell away. Spinning on his heel, he turned his body towards the blonde girl and slashed at her neck. The white-haired girl rushed towards his ankles with the cutlass. Ash paused and stabbed Stormruler into the deck of the ship. The resulting clang of metal striking metal filled his ears as he blocked her attempt to catch him off guard. Whipping out another kukuri, Ash hurled it towards Halflight as the man prepared another arrow. Swinging his birch bow, Halflight deflected the throwing knife away from his body as he knocked another invisible arrow and took aim towards Ash. Ripping Stormruler free of the deck, along with several planks of wood, Ash parried the girl's cutlass upwards and slammed his heel into her chest and forced her to the ground before thrusting Stormruler towards Halflight, releasing a blast of wind as a projectile which caused the man to roll backwards with the gale force winds. David flung himself onto the main deck to avoid a beam of light shooting towards him. The angel floated after him with its hands outstretched. The being beat its wings backwards and disappeared back through the circular portal and vanished into thin air. Pulling himself back up, David span around and scanned his surroundings before catching sight of Oscar pushing himself back to his feet and looking around, the knight using his sword to prop his body up while Drake strode past him with a scowl. "Stop stabbing my ship," she grumbled as she twirled her pistol. "Where'd the bastard go?" The space in front of her ripped open as the angel appeared again. The woman let out a strangled gasp and raised the gun towards the being's head just as it leveled its glowing palm in her face. Hovel's boot slammed into its side and sent the angel flying away from her and slamming into the deck of the ship, cracking the wood inwards. "Always hated angels," he grunted out as he lowered his boot, manifesting his club and shield. Pre. 10. Tias. The angel unfurled its arms and pushed itself out of the indentation in the wood, raising its body up until it was floating a foot off the ground and fixing its attention entirely upon Havel. The dark hooded head stared at him before it beat its wings backwards and disappeared through another gate. Havel let out a snort in response. Space behind Blackbeard tore open as the angel appeared. The pirate looked over his shoulder at the being and then gave a sigh. Yeah. This is getting to be way too much of a hassle than I was willing to entertain, he whined. Why can't anything just go right for me? This really hurts my feelings, you know, Sammy? The angel, Sammy, just stared at him for a few moments in complete silence. At least you like to listen to me, right? He grumbled. Oh well. He strode towards the bow of his ship and leaned over the railings. Better get to it. The servants across the deck seemingly blinked out of existence in a flash of light, startling most of those who were still engaged in a fight with them before they rematerialized on board the deck of Blackbeard's ship. The black-armored knight lowered his sword and gave Blackbeard a frown. You wish to use it now? He inquired, and what of your prize? Up, 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 Blackbeard silenced him while grinning. I just needed time and besides. He pointed towards Asterios. Ugly as that guy is. He understands her beauty enough to protect her from the worst of the harm. He paused and shrugged. Also the Grail will help me with any bruising on poor Urieli-chan if she gets hurt. Instant teleportation. Romani blurted out behind Ritska as the servants disappeared. I guess that's all the confirmation we need that he has the Grail, but why did he? Coward or ya? Drake shouted at Blackbeard. Get over here and take beaten like a man, you son of a. Hag noises. Ew, Blackbeard cringed, then gave a shrug, but I guess I can entertain you. I'll do this myself then. He threw his arms wide while sporting a maniac grin. Here's a present from the past to the future. He looked to Urieli and swooned. Don't worry, Urieli-chan. If you get hurt I'll take extra good care of you, okay? Fujimaru-kun. Romani called out in growing horror. I'm sensing a dramatic rise in magical energy. He's going to use his noble phantasm. Ritska widened his eyes. Mash. They darted over to the shielder. Use your shield to protect us. Mash gave a single nod and rushed towards the direction of the hull. It's too close. Ash thrust his sword towards Blackbeard's sails, releasing a tremendous gust of hurricane-force winds towards the boat. Blackbeard stumbled forwards in surprise as the ships were separated from each other. The damage to the Golden Hind being revealed in full as the predominant hole in the starboard side of the ship was unveiled at barely above the water level. Shattered planks of wood dangled from the hole with some dropping into the sea. The larger ship was gradually blown back as Blackbeard's eyes darted from his sails to Ash and narrowed. Talk about talking the wind out of her sails. The pirate muttered, thanks for clearing the distance though. Ash-san. Mash stared at him in shock. The saber looked at her with a frown. We'd have never blocked it at point-blank range, he replied without missing a beat. He's right. Drake rushed up the ship and towards the wheel of the ship, put some of that wind in the sails. She cried out, Men, get some of those barrel bombs up here and brace yourselves. Let's get to this, Blackbeard hollered with a grin as he thrust his arms forwards. Queen Anne's revenge. Mash. Ritska cried out as he threw himself flat onto the desk. Mash rushed towards the edge of the ship and slammed her shield into the deck. Lord Chaldeas. The blue energy of the shield expanded outwards as Drake rapidly began to turn the ship while Ash was blasting wind into the sails, to speed up the ship. The front of Blackbeard's ship unleashed a titanic barrage of firepower towards the stern of the ship as it turned away from his own. Mash's noble phantasm covered the back end of the ship just in time for the enemy noble phantasm to collide with her. The girl grit her teeth as the force behind the attack slammed into her with far more power than she had been expecting. Her feet slipped back across the deck of the ship before she braced herself. Ha! Releasing a cry, the shielder put all her effort into defending the ship before the light died down and unveiled the back end of the ship slightly scorched but still in one piece. Nice job, Mashu-chan. She shivered at the tone and saw Blackbeard giving her a thumbs up. That was totally cool. I really wasn't expecting you to do that. He nodded. Guess I'll just have to give it another go. Mash's eyes widened as the energy surge built up again. He's going again. Romani exclaimed in shock, but even with the Holy Grail, that kind of power. Ritska. Ash came to a stop next to the boy. Permission to use noble phantasm to disable them and allow our escape? Sure. Ritska all but shouted, go for it. Ash nodded his head and rushed towards the stern of the ship while going for his bottomless box, his hand grasping the hilt of a specific sword he hadn't wielded in some time. He slowly began to pull the blade of the greatsword free. It was the only sword he had that hadn't originally belonged to someone else. One more time guys. Blackbeard prepared himself. Q. Sammy pulled him to the side as an arrow shot past where his head had been moments earlier. Archer clicked his tongue at failing to nail the captain before his eyes flickered over to Ash as the saber slid to a halt next to Mash. The girl's eyes fixed themselves on the new greatsword in his hands. Unveiling the dark platinum-colored sword, Ash fixed his gaze entirely upon Blackbeard's ship. The sword itself looked as though it had been made from freshly molded steel. The surface of the blade was still rough. The hilt of the blade was a reverse V shape facing upwards into the body of the sword. Running from the center of the blade upwards was the glowing mark of something within the metal. Ash pulled the sword back. Holy sword. Unsheathed. The dark platinum blade began to glow with a brilliant white light. This sword is a reflection of a cursed fate. The blade illuminated itself bright enough that Mash had to squint her eyes and look away. Holy sword of union, swing once again. He thrust the blade forwards as Blackbeard's ship began to turn away to try and avoid the blow. Undetan Galvatine. Ash thrust the sword forwards in the direction of the Queen Anne Revenge's mast. The servants on board the ship ducked low as the beam of pure holy light shot over their heads and slammed into the mast of the ship. For a few moments the sword's beam of light was seemingly stunted by the strength of the noble phantasm before Ash swung the blade upwards and cleaved through the sails of the ship instead, instantly burning them away while leaving the supports intact before the beam cut off. Holy shit! Drake exclaimed in shock as she stared at the damage before flashing Ash a surprised look. That's good. Buys us some time. She continued to spin the wheel of the ship as they pulled away from Blackbeard, the pirate slowly starting to rise to his feet and stare at his burning sails. Ash lowered his sword to his side as he stared at the damage, giving a single nod before moving away, barely catching the looks of surprise he got from Mash as she still stared at the sword. Galvatine. Romani's voice muttered to himself. Like Galatine. He hummed, that's a weird coincidence. Ash stared in the direction of the doctor before dismissing it. I imagine the ship is in poor condition. Yeah. Drake walked away from the wheel and towards the side of the ship, staring down at the hole in the ship with a grimace. We'll need that fixed. Oscar coughed. We shall need materials then, will we not? We can worry about that later. Drake dismissed as she turned around and stared at the gradually shrinking shape of Blackbeard's ship. I'm not heading in any specific direction until that guy is out of sight. Assuming they don't have another way of tracking you. Romani frowned, still. Wasn't expecting Ash to pull out an anti-army noble phantasm. He chuckled. The level it was definitely a rank. That's a pretty powerful oh no. He shouted in shock. Fujimaru-kun, how are you feeling? Ritsuka rubbed his brow. A little tired. Probably the consecutive use of 2 noble phantasms plus the mystic codes. Olga surmised, for now, focus on escape. We can work on a plan of attack later. She didn't receive much in the way of a counter-argument. Got the barrel bombs, boss. 2 pirates emerged from under the deck carrying the wooden containers. Where de ya? Huh? Drake blinked. Oh, you can take him back. Don't need them anymore. Alright boss. The 2 men's shoulders slumped. Just got him up too. These are heavy, they grumbled quietly as they descended back down the stairs. And, so we see another noble phantasm of Ash. This is the Twin Prince's greatsword. I know you can only get it in Ing Plus, but I'm just saying that he decided to trade it in exchange for the 2 swords in exchange for one or the other. Here are its stats. Twin Prince's greatsword. A+, Undetan Galvatine, Sword of the Cursed Union. A+, Anti-Army, max target. 300, max range. 1 to 30. Sword is ignited with holy fire and swung in an arc. Alternatively it can be fired in a beam of light. Anyway, you also saw some more servants. Including Knight King Rendell from DS1. But no Hector, because it makes no sense for Hector of Troy to want to help destroy the world. We also saw Half-Light, Dark Lurker and a bronze man with 2 shuttles. Hey Lautrec. Obviously won't dump 4 characters worth of stats and dialogue in one go, so we'll do them one at a time over the next few chapters. Starting up. Rendell. Night King Rendell Servant. Saber. Strength. B. A. Endurance. B plus Agility. B Mana. D. Luck. C. Noble Phantasm. B. Lost Knights. Invasion of Failure. C. Anti-Army. Max Target. 100. Max Range. 1 to 20. The Balder Knights invaded Sen's fortress and were met with failure and hollowed. As their king, he holds responsibility for this failure. He can inflict a state of mental confusion upon the targets, making it difficult for them to discern friend from foe, and for those with low magic resistance, they can even forget who they are or why they were even there for a few moments. Drachenzer Tyler. B. Anti-Unit. Max Target. 1. Max Range. 1 to 5. Rendell slew a drake in single combat by slashing it to pieces. He will strike in repeated high-powered slashes designed to destroy the target. It is also registered as an anti-dragon type NP. Class skills. Riding. D. Magic resistance. C. Personal skills. Charisma. B. King of the Kingdom of Balder. Battle continuation. A. Monstrous strength. A dragon slayer. B. Slew a Hellkite drake in single combat. Ring of protection. B. Apply A+ stat to endurance. Summoning. Servant. Saber. I am Rendell, king of the Balder Kingdom of Knights. I ask of you, have you the potential to be a knight? Dialogue 1. You spend much time doing nothing. It is best you dissuade yourself of this notion. Indolence is the enemy. Dialogue 2. Balder. Well, we were not too different from the kingdom of Astora. Although we were better at drake hunting. Dragons? No, drakes. A dragon was a rare thing and not something that I would challenge lightly. Dialogue 3. It is troubling. My kingdom is known for falling to ruin and I am known for failure. Dialogue 4. If you have Knights of Round Table, I see that you have knights present already. It is difficult to admit. I would say that they are more skilled than my knights. It means that I need only train harder to clear this gap, no? Dialogue 5. If you have Sigward, is that a Katarinen knight? I'm not terribly surprised. They have a penchant for adventure. We even saw many in Balder before its collapse. Dialogue 6. If you have Artoria Pendragon, King of Knights. For one whose title is Night King, I assume you too can see an issue, no? Well. No, it's not true contest. She's a stronger knight than me. Although it seems our ends were not dissimilar. Both our kingdoms lost to ruin and our knights dead. Although I did lead mine to theirs. Dialogue 7. If you have Oscar or Anri, a knight of Astora? Those are knights of virtue as well. It's an old country of chivalry which produced a great many heroes. The tale of the evil eye beast is known even to me. Dialogue 8. If you have Black Iron Tarkus. So, you cleared the fortress, did you? I understand your noble phantasm recreates it. No? If I could ask a favor. I wonder if I could make another attempt at it. Dialogue 9. If you have Archon or Lado. Silver Knights, you hear many tales of them as a child growing up. The legendary knights of the gods of Lordran, but seeing one now. I can tell we match in skill, but I am the Night King. If my skill is only equal to a foot soldier of the gods, did I ever really? No, there is no sense in reminiscing now. Dialogue 10. If you have 4 Knights of Gwyn, extraordinary. The tales do not compare to the individuals. A master spearman, swordsman, archer and even assassin. I wonder where I ever thought I could invade a city protected by these beings. Dialogue 11. If you have Firekeeper, a firekeeper. It does not surprise me. You have a great many undead here. No? Then it is natural. They are always present to provide comfort to us. Dialogue 12. If you have Torin, Millwood Chieftain. Was that a Millwood warrior? Those druid warriors were legendary for their devotion to that spirit tree. Their disappearance was a little before my time though. Likes alike? Well, I have always enjoyed knightly tales. Slaying of great dragons or even challenging the gods themselves. It might not have worked out that well for me though. Hates labyrinths. I hate labyrinths. Well, I also hate someone who lets their arrogance get the better of them. Like a fool who leads his people on doomed crusade based on the word of a hearsay prophecy. Wish for the Holy Grail. A wish. I suppose I would wish for the restoration of my kingdom. Failing that, I'd at least want another attempt at clearing Sen's fortress. I know it can be done. I don't care about the undead prophecy, I want to clear that fortress. Bond level 1. You are a surprisingly brave one for a mage. Most enjoyed studying their books. I approve of this change. Blonde level 2. I wonder if we shall go anywhere special soon. Forgive me. Perhaps I am still too adventurous for my own good. Blonde level 3. My tenure as king. I've never given it much consideration if I were to speak truthfully. I was king for around 10 years before the curse struck us. Life was difficult. Many hollowed suddenly and it imploded. I rallied the survivors and we formed a nomadic group for a time. Then I heard tale of a prophecy in Lordran. Well, you know the rest. Bond level 4. I am still a knight, first and foremost. This means I reward loyalty with loyalty and betrayal with scorn. I also reward friendship with friendship. Bond level 5. Come then, we have places to explore and monsters to slay, although I realize you won't but doing much of the latter, unless you wish for me to help you in that regard, no. Birthday. A birthday. By the heavens, it has been long since I celebrated one of those. Yes, I still remember the ceremony though. We just need to set up the simulator for a small tourney. During an event, quite the ruckus outside, however, I sense this holds great possibility. Let us be on our way. First ascension, Well, this is strange, haven't felt this good in years. Second ascension, again, although, shoulder is still a bit stiff. Third ascension, gods. This armor takes me back. Helmet even has a crown on it. Never actually wore the crown all that much, armor doesn't actually look any different from the other Knights of Baldur either. Fourth ascension, shoulders nice and loose again. Oh, right. Thanks for the support, I'll endeavor to exceed your expectations. Hopefully it won't end like my last venture.